What if everything you know about history is a lie? What if powerful artifacts, revolutionary ideas, and shocking truths have been deliberately hidden for thousands of years? Today, I'll reveal 50 secrets that governments, religious institutions, and academic elites never wanted you to uncover. Secrets so profound they could reshape your understanding of religion, science, and human civilization. From the vanished Ark of the Covenant to lost gospels showing Mary Magdalene as a religious leader, to a mysterious device that could see into the past. This isn't just ancient history, it's happening now. Over the next hour, we'll dive into archaeological evidence, controversial theories, and undeniable patterns of information control. Are you ready to discover the truths they've hidden? Let's start with the most mysterious artifact in history, one that vanished without a trace and might still be out there. We begin with the most famous missing artifact in human history, the Ark of the Covenant. This wasn't just a religious symbol. According to ancient texts, it was a weapon so powerful it could level armies and kill anyone who touched it improperly. The biblical account describes a golden chest containing the stone tablets Moses received from God. But the ark was far more than a storage box. When the Israelites carried it into battle, enemy forces fled in terror. The Philistines captured it once and were struck by mysterious plagues until they returned it with gold offerings. Here's what makes this story fascinating. The ark's described effects resemble electromagnetic phenomena. People who touched it died instantly, suggesting some kind of electrical discharge. It glowed with mysterious light and made strange sounds, possibly indicating an unknown energy source. But in 586 BC, when Babylon conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple, the ark vanished completely. No trace in the historical record. No mention of it being captured or destroyed. It simply disappeared. So where did it go? The book of Maccabees claims the prophet Jeremiah hid it in a secret cave before the Babylonian invasion. He sealed the entrance and declared it would remain hidden until God gathered his people again. But no cave has ever been found. Ethiopia claims to possess the real ark. The Church of St. Mary of Zion in Axum allegedly houses it, guarded by a single monk who can never leave the premises. Only this guardian can see the ark, making verification impossible. Ethiopian tradition says Queen Sheba's son, with King Solomon, stole it from Jerusalem centuries before the Babylonian conquest. But Western scholars dismiss the Ethiopian claim as medieval fiction. They point out that no historical connection between Ethiopia and the Ark exists before the 4th century AD, long after the Ark disappeared. Another theory suggests the Knights Templar found it during their excavations beneath Solomon's temple. This would explain their sudden wealth and power in the 12th century. Some believe they transported it to Europe, possibly hiding it in Scotland or southern France. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys around Jerusalem have detected underground chambers that might contain ancient artifacts, but political and religious sensitivities make excavation impossible. The Temple Mount remains one of the most contested religious sites on Earth. Israeli archaeologist Leon Rittmeyer spent decades studying the Temple Mount and believes he's identified the exact location where the Ark once stood. But proving his theory would require excavation that could trigger international conflict. The most intriguing possibility is that the Ark remains hidden beneath Jerusalem, waiting to be rediscovered. If it still exists and possesses the properties described in ancient texts, its recovery could revolutionize our understanding of ancient technology and religious history. Whether the Ark was an advanced device, a religious symbol, or something else entirely, its disappearance represents one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The fact that such a central artifact of Judaism and Christianity could vanish without explanation suggests that other important relics might also be hidden from public knowledge. In 326 AD, Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine, traveled to Jerusalem and allegedly discovered the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified. This find legitimized Constantine's Christian empire and established a precedent for religious relics supporting political power. According to church historians, Helena found 3 crosses buried beneath a pagan temple that Emperor Hadrian had built over Calvary. To identify the true cross, she tested each one on a dying woman, When the third cross touched her, the woman was instantly healed, revealing Christ's cross. But here's the problem. This story appears nowhere in contemporary records. It was first written down decades later and contains numerous historical impossibilities. First, Romans didn't preserve crucifixion crosses. Wood was valuable and was routinely reused or burned. Leaving crosses to rot for 3 centuries would have been economically wasteful and practically impossible. Second, identifying the exact crucifixion site after 300 years of urban destruction and rebuilding would have been nearly impossible. Jerusalem was completely leveled in 70 AD and rebuilt as a Roman city with different street layouts. Third, the healing miracle conveniently provided divine authentication for what was essentially a political necessity. Constantine needed religious legitimacy for his conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. Modern analysis reveals an even more troubling pattern. Medieval Europe contains enough fragments of the true cross to build several crosses. Churches across the continent claim to possess pieces, often accompanied by certificates of authenticity that trace back to Helena's discovery. Carbon dating of several supposed true cross fragments shows they come from different time periods, some dating to the medieval era rather than the 1st century. This suggests systematic fraud rather than authentic preservation of a single relic. The True Cross story reveals how religious relics function as political tools. Helena's discovery provided divine approval for Constantine's controversial religious policies while establishing Jerusalem as Christianity's holy center under Roman control. Archaeological evidence suggests Helena's pilgrimage was more about imperial propaganda than genuine religious discovery. The churches she built and the relics she found served to establish Christian legitimacy while maintaining Roman imperial authority. The True Cross legend demonstrates how religious narratives can be constructed to serve political needs, even when historical evidence doesn't support the claims being made. From 1939 to 1949, Vatican archaeologists conducted one of the most secretive excavations in history, digging beneath St. Peter's Basilica to find the tomb of Christianity's first pope. What they discovered was far more complex and controversial than the official reports acknowledged. The Vatican announced they had found Peter's tomb and bones, confirming Catholic claims about papal succession, but the archaeological evidence tells a more ambiguous story that raises troubling questions about how religious institutions use science to support theological claims. The excavation revealed an extensive Roman necropolis with hundreds of burials spanning several centuries. Among these was a shrine that early Christians had venerated, suggesting they believed Peter was buried there. But identifying any specific burial as Peter's proved impossible with archaeological methods. The bones eventually identified as Peter's were found in a wall cavity, not in the original burial location. They belonged to an elderly man from the 1st century, but DNA testing wasn't available to confirm identity. Any connection to Peter remained speculative. More problematically, the archaeological team was entirely Catholic, with Vatican oversight controlling every aspect of the investigation. Independent peer review was prohibited, and many findings remain unpublished even today. The official announcement in 1968 that Peter's bones had been found served important institutional purposes. It confirmed Vatican claims about papal authority and Peter's presence in Rome, countering Protestant challenges to Catholic succession claims. But the scientific evidence was much weaker than the confident public statements suggested. The identification relied more on circumstantial evidence and theological assumptions than on archaeological proof. This case reveals how religious institutions can use archaeological discoveries to support doctrinal positions, even when the evidence is ambiguous. The Vatican's control over the excavation and interpretation ensured that findings would support rather than challenge official teaching. The secrecy surrounding many aspects of this excavation suggests that additional evidence exists that might complicate the official narrative. Independent review might reveal interpretations that don't align with Vatican interests. For over 1,000 years, St. Christopher was one of Christianity's most beloved saints, patron of travelers and protector against sudden death. Millions of Christians wore his medals and prayed for his protection. Then in 1969, the Catholic Church quietly removed him from the official calendar, admitting they couldn't prove he ever existed. This erasure reveals how religious institutions can systematically eliminate traditions when they become inconvenient, even after centuries of encouraging devotion. Saint Christopher's story was enormously popular throughout medieval Christianity. He was depicted as a giant who carried travelers across a dangerous river. One day, a small child asked for passage, but became impossibly heavy during the crossing. The child revealed himself as Christ, explaining that Christopher had carried the weight of the world. Churches throughout Europe contained Christopher's image, and travelers routinely prayed to him for protection. His feast day was widely celebrated, and numerous hospitals and organizations bore his name. But Christopher's removal wasn't isolated. The Second Vatican Council eliminated about 40 saints from the universal calendar, all for lack of historical evidence. This systematic purge eliminated beloved figures who had been venerated for centuries. The official explanation was that these saints represented pious legends rather than historical persons. But this raises uncomfortable questions about the entire basis of saint veneration. If the Church couldn't verify Christopher's existence, how reliable were other saint stories? More troubling is the implication for ordinary believers. People had prayed to Christopher for generations, believing in his intercession and protection. The Church's admission that he might not exist essentially invalidated centuries of sincere devotion. The Christopher case reveals how religious traditions develop independently of historical verification, then become so embedded in popular practice that challenging them creates institutional problems. Archaeological and textual analysis suggests Christopher's story may have originated from pre-Christian mythology about river gods and protective giants. Early Christianity often absorbed local traditions by converting pagan figures into Christian saints. The systematic removal of questionable saints demonstrates how modern historical scholarship can conflict with traditional religious practice. Institutions must choose between maintaining popular traditions and acknowledging historical uncertainty. Christopher's elimination was handled quietly to minimize disruption, but it established a precedent for removing beloved religious figures when their historical basis becomes untenable. The Knights Templar began as 9 poor knights protecting Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem. Within decades, they became Europe's most powerful financial institution. Their sudden wealth and mysterious rituals led to accusations of heresy and devil worship that culminated in their destruction on Friday the 13th, 1307. But recent scholarship suggests the Templars may have discovered something beneath Solomon's temple that revolutionized their understanding of Christianity and provided the foundation for their enormous wealth. The Templars established their headquarters on the Temple Mount, directly above the ruins of Solomon's temple. For 9 years, they conducted excavations in the underground chambers, officially searching for relics, but possibly finding much more. Archaeological evidence shows extensive Templar tunneling beneath the Temple Mount. Some researchers believe they discovered ancient documents or artifacts that provided leverage over church authorities or revealed valuable trade secrets. Their rapid accumulation of wealth defies explanation through conventional means. Within 50 years, they owned thousands of properties across Europe and had become the continent's premier banking institution, pioneering international finance and credit systems. The charges brought against them in 1307 focused on their alleged worship of a mysterious figure called Baphomet, described as a bearded head or an androgynous demon. Under torture, many Templars confessed to participating in secret rituals involving this entity. Modern scholars generally dismiss these confessions as products of torture and political manipulation by King Philip IV of France, who owed the Templars enormous debts. The Baphomet accusations may have been fabricated to justify seizing Templar wealth, but alternative interpretations suggest Baphomet might represent something more complex than devil worship. The name possibly derives from Muhammad, suggesting Templar exposure to Islamic mystical traditions during their time in the Holy Land. Some researchers propose that Baphomet symbolized the reconciliation of opposites, a concept found in various esoteric traditions. The androgynous imagery might represent the unity of masculine and feminine principles, rather than demonic worship. The Templars' sudden suppression eliminated any opportunity to understand what they had actually discovered or practiced. The systematic destruction of their records and the execution of their leaders ensured that their secrets died with them. When the Templars were arrested, their legendary treasure disappeared. Ships left Templar ports before the arrests, and vast quantities of gold and documents vanished without trace. Some believe this wealth funded later esoteric organizations or was hidden in locations that remain secret today. Scotland provided refuge for fleeing Templars, and some researchers suggest they influenced the development of Freemasonry and other secret societies. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland contains mysterious symbolism that some interpret as Templar-influenced. The Templar mystery demonstrates how the suppression of inconvenient groups can eliminate historical evidence and create enduring legends. Whether they discovered ancient secrets, developed heretical beliefs, or simply became too powerful for medieval authorities to tolerate, their destruction ensured that the truth would remain hidden. Their story reveals the dangerous intersection of religious authority, political power, and financial control that characterized medieval Europe and continues to influence modern institutions. As we examine these sacred relics and religious artifacts, a clear pattern emerges. Objects and traditions that might challenge official religious narratives tend to disappear, be discredited, or be brought under institutional control. Whether through outright suppression, scholarly dismissal, or administrative reorganization, inconvenient evidence about Christianity's origins and development has been systematically managed to maintain doctrinal consistency. This doesn't necessarily invalidate religious faith, but it does reveal how human institutions shape spiritual narratives to serve their own interests and maintain their authority over believers' understanding of the sacred. The missing and controlled relics we've examined represent just a small fraction of the religious artifacts and traditions that have been suppressed, hidden, or eliminated throughout Christian history. Each hidden relic suggests others that remain concealed, waiting for discovery or revelation. When we move to our next section about hidden documents and forbidden texts, we'll see how the same pattern of institutional control extends to written records, creating gaps in our knowledge that may conceal truths as significant as any missing artifact. Deep beneath Vatican City lies one of the world's most restricted collections of documents. The Vatican's secret archives contain 85 kilometers of shelving holding over 35,000 volumes of texts spanning 1,200 years. Until 1881, no outsider was allowed access. Even today, only selected scholars can view carefully chosen documents, and nothing after 1939 remains classified. What exactly is the Vatican hiding in those 53 miles of shelving? The official name Archivum Secretum means private archive, rather than secret, but the distinction matters little when access remains so restricted. Scholars who've gained entry describe a treasure trove of historical documents that could revolutionize our understanding of European history, religious development, and political intrigue. The archives contain correspondence between popes and world leaders throughout history. Letters between Vatican officials and Hitler's regime remain classified, fueling speculation about Catholic collaboration with fascism. Documents related to the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the suppression of heretical movements could reveal systematic persecution that contradicts official church histories. Most intriguingly, rumors persist that the archives contain Gospels and early Christian texts that were excluded from the biblical canon. If authentic Gospels exist that present different accounts of Jesus' life and teachings, their suppression would represent one of history's greatest cover-ups. What if the documents prove a different version of Christianity entirely? Could the greatest secret of the Church still be buried beneath the Vatican? The Vatican claims some documents remain classified to protect living individuals or diplomatic relations. But critics argue this excuse is used to hide embarrassing or contradictory evidence about church history and doctrine. In 2019, Pope Francis opened some World War II-era archives, revealing documents about the Catholic response to the Holocaust. These releases showed that Vatican officials knew more about Nazi atrocities than previously acknowledged, raising questions about what other historical events might be documented in still classified materials. The systematic digitization of Vatican archives proceeds slowly and selectively. The Vatican controls which documents are digitized and made available to researchers, ensuring continued institutional control over historical narratives. Recent leaks suggest the archives contain evidence of financial corruption, political manipulation, and cover-ups of sexual abuse that could devastate the Church's reputation if fully revealed. The Vatican's fierce protection of these documents indicates their explosive potential. Archaeological surveys suggest additional underground chambers beneath the Vatican that may contain even older documents and artifacts. Some researchers believe these hidden vaults might house pre-Christian texts, early Gospels, or documents related to the Roman Empire's transition to Christianity. According to some critics, the Vatican's restricted access policies may limit scholarly understanding of certain historical periods. However, Church officials maintain these restrictions, protect sensitive diplomatic and personal information, while preserving the integrity of historical documents. The 1947 discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls represented one of archaeology's greatest finds, providing unprecedented insight into Jewish and early Christian religious development. But the story of their suppression and controlled release reveals how scholarly cabals can control historical interpretation for decades. A Bedouin shepherd boy stumbled upon jars containing ancient scrolls in caves near Qumran. The texts, dating from 300 BC to 100 AD, included the earliest known copies of biblical books and previously unknown religious writings that challenged conventional understanding of Judaism and Christianity's origins. The scrolls revealed that Jewish religious thought was far more diverse than previously known. The Qumran community practiced baptism, shared property, and followed a teacher of righteousness who was persecuted by religious authorities. These parallels to early Christianity raised uncomfortable questions about Christian originality. But here's where the scandal begins. A small international team of scholars was granted exclusive access to study and publish the scrolls. For over 40 years, they tightly controlled which texts were released and how they were interpreted, effectively censoring one of history's most important archaeological discoveries. Team members took decades to publish individual texts while preventing other scholars from accessing the materials. Some members died without publishing their assigned scrolls, taking their interpretations to the grave. The delays fueled speculation that controversial materials were being suppressed. The scrolls contained references to figures and events that didn't match official religious histories. Some texts described apocalyptic expectations and messianic figures that preceded Jesus, suggesting Christian concepts weren't as original as claimed. Pressure from the international scholarly community finally forced full publication in 1991. The complete release revealed texts that had been deliberately withheld, including materials that challenged traditional interpretations of biblical development and early Christian uniqueness. One of the most controversial documents was the Copper Scroll, which listed locations of hidden treasures with detailed directions and enormous quantities of gold and silver. If authentic, these treasures might represent the lost wealth of the Jerusalem temple, hidden before the Roman destruction in 70 AD. The systematic delays in publication suggest that religious and academic authorities collaborated to suppress evidence that might disturb established beliefs. The scholars' control over interpretation ensured that challenging materials were either withheld or presented in ways that minimized their controversial implications. Recent technological advances have allowed researchers to read previously illegible fragments, revealing additional texts that complicate official religious narratives. These discoveries continue to emerge, suggesting that the full implications of the Dead Sea Scrolls remain unknown. The suppression of the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrates how scholarly gatekeepers can control historical interpretation, even when dealing with objective archaeological evidence. During Christianity's first centuries, numerous Gospels circulated among different Christian communities. Only 4 made it into the New Testament. The systematic exclusion of alternative Gospels eliminated diverse perspectives on Jesus' life and teachings, creating a false impression of early Christian unity. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it focuses on spiritual knowledge rather than narrative stories. Jesus is quoted saying, "The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it, suggesting mystical rather than apocalyptic Christianity. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene portrays her as Jesus' most important disciple, receiving special revelations that other apostles couldn't understand. Peter objects to Mary's authority, saying, "Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Are we to turn about and all listen to her?" This text suggests early conflicts about women's roles in Christian leadership. The Gospel of Judas, published in 2006, presents Judas not as a betrayer, but as Jesus' most trusted disciple, chosen to fulfill a necessary role in God's plan. This radically different interpretation challenges fundamental assumptions about Jesus' death and Judas's motivations. Multiple infancy Gospels describe Jesus' childhood with stories of miraculous events and teachings. These texts were popular among early Christians, but were excluded from the canon, possibly because they presented a view of Jesus that conflicted with later theological developments. The Gospel of Peter described the crucifixion from a docetic perspective, emphasizing Jesus' divine nature over his humanity. Its exclusion reflected theological decisions rather than historical authenticity, as it may have been as early as the canonical Gospels. The process of canonization wasn't simply about selecting the most accurate texts. Political, theological, and practical considerations all influenced which books were accepted and which were rejected. The winners of early Christian theological disputes determined which Gospels would be preserved and which would be forgotten. Church fathers like Athanasius actively campaigned against alternative Gospels, labeling them heretical and ordering their destruction. The systematic elimination of these texts created the false impression that early Christianity was unified in its beliefs and practices. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal early Christian diversity that was systematically suppressed. These alternative Gospels show that Christianity could have developed very differently if other theological perspectives had prevailed. Beyond the excluded Gospels, numerous other books were considered scripture by some Christian communities, but were ultimately rejected by Orthodox authorities. These apocryphal texts provide insight into the diversity of early Christian thought and the political nature of biblical canonization. The Book of Enoch was considered scripture by early Christians and is still canonical in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. It describes the Watchers, divine beings who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, producing giant offspring called Nephilim. These themes appear in Genesis, but Enoch provides extensive detail that was apparently too controversial for inclusion in most Christian Bibles. The Book of Jubilees retold biblical stories with additional details and interpretations that differed from canonical accounts. Some early Christian communities considered it authoritative, but its alternative chronology and theological perspectives led to its exclusion from most biblical canons. The Shepherd of Hermas was widely read in early Christian communities and was included in some early biblical manuscripts. Its mystical visions and moral teachings were influential, but it was eventually excluded, possibly because its late composition couldn't be attributed to apostolic authority. Various acts of different apostles describe missionary activities and teachings that weren't included in the canonical Acts of the Apostles. These texts often contain theological positions that became controversial, leading to their systematic suppression. The decision about which books were inspired and which were merely human compositions often reflected the theological and political preferences of church authorities rather than objective criteria about divine authorship or historical accuracy. No loss of knowledge in human history has been mourned more than the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. But the true story of its demise reveals a systematic campaign to eliminate knowledge that threatened religious and political authorities. Rather than a single tragic accident, the Library of Alexandria was the ancient world's greatest center of learning, housing an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls covering every field of knowledge. Scholars traveled from across the known world to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature in its halls. The library's collection policy was remarkably comprehensive. Ships entering Alexandria's harbor were required to surrender all books for copying, ensuring that the library acquired texts from throughout the Mediterranean world. This systematic collection created an unprecedented concentration of human knowledge. But the library didn't die in a single dramatic fire, as popular imagination suggests. Instead, it suffered a slow death through systematic neglect, budget cuts, and deliberate targeting by authorities who viewed its secular knowledge as threatening to religious orthodoxy. The first major damage occurred during Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BC, when fires spread from the harbor to parts of the library district. However, contemporary accounts suggest this damage was limited and the library continued functioning. More serious destruction came in 391 AD when Christian Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. The Serapeum, which housed part of the library's collection, was demolished by Christian mobs led by Archbishop Theophilus. Valuable manuscripts were burned as pagan literature. The final blow may have come with the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 AD. Later Islamic sources claim that Caliph Omar ordered the library's remaining books burned, declaring that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were harmful. However, many historians consider this account a later fabrication designed to blame Muslims for Christianity's earlier destruction of pagan learning. Archaeological evidence suggests the library's decline was gradual, reflecting the broader transformation of the Roman Empire from a secular state that valued learning to a Christian empire that prioritized religious orthodoxy over intellectual inquiry. The loss of Alexandria's collection eliminated countless works that might have accelerated scientific and technological development by centuries. We know that Archimedes, Euclid, and other great scholars produced works that survived only in fragments or were lost entirely. More troubling is evidence suggesting that some destruction was deliberate rather than accidental. Christian authorities viewed pagan philosophy and scientific inquiry as threats to religious faith, leading to systematic campaigns against secular learning. The Library of Alexandria's destruction established a pattern of knowledge suppression that would characterize much of medieval history. When religious authorities controlled education and determined which ideas were acceptable for preservation and study, throughout history, religious and political authorities have created false documents to support their claims to power and legitimacy. These forgeries were often accepted as authentic for centuries, shaping historical understanding and political development in ways that served the forger's interests. The donation of Constantine, one of history's most influential forgeries, claimed that Emperor Constantine granted the Pope temporal authority over Western Europe. This document was used for centuries to justify papal political power and territorial claims. Despite being completely fabricated in the 8th or 9th century, the false decretals, a collection of forged papal letters, were created to support claims about papal supremacy and clerical privileges. These documents influenced medieval church law and political theory for centuries before being exposed as fraudulent during the Renaissance. The letters of Pontius Pilate, purporting to be correspondence between the Roman governor and Emperor Tiberius about Jesus' trial, circulated widely in medieval Europe. These letters provided details about Jesus' appearance and the crucifixion that weren't found in the Gospels, but they were eventually proven to be medieval fabrications. Numerous false martyrdom accounts were created to establish the authority of particular saints or religious communities. These fabricated stories provided model lives for Christian imitation while supporting the political and economic interests of the institutions that promoted them. The systematic creation of false documents reveals how historical narratives can be deliberately constructed to serve contemporary purposes. Many beliefs about medieval history and religious development are based on documents that were known to be false, but continued to influence popular understanding. The exposure of these forgeries during the Renaissance contributed to religious reformation and political revolution, as people realized that many foundations of authority were based on fabricated evidence. Modern scholarly methods for detecting forgeries have revealed that numerous documents considered authentic for centuries were actually created to support particular ideological or institutional positions. Archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed that many stories in the biblical book of Genesis have striking parallels in much older Mesopotamian literature, raising questions about the originality and divine inspiration of biblical narratives. The Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation epic dating to at least 1800 BC, describes the creation of the world through divine conflict and the ordering of chaos. Its parallels to Genesis chapter 1 suggest either direct influence or common cultural origins for creation stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative remarkably similar to the story of Noah, including a righteous man warned by divine revelation, animals saved in a boat, and birds sent out to find dry land. The Mesopotamian version predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic describes the creation of humans from clay, divine frustration with human noise and wickedness, and a great flood sent as punishment. These themes appear throughout early Genesis, but apparently originated in Babylonian religious literature. These discoveries suggest that biblical authors drew heavily from existing Mesopotamian traditions rather than receiving completely original revelations. The borrowing may have occurred during the Babylonian exile when Jewish leaders were exposed to Mesopotamian literature and incorporated its themes into their own religious narratives. The implications are significant for understanding biblical authority and inspiration. If Genesis stories were adapted from pagan literature, this challenges claims about their unique divine origin and suggests that Scripture reflects human cultural borrowing rather than pure revelation. Religious communities have responded to these discoveries in various ways, from acknowledging cultural influence while maintaining divine inspiration to dismissing archaeological evidence that contradicts traditional beliefs about biblical origins. As we conclude this examination of hidden documents and forbidden texts, we see how the control of written information has been used throughout history to shape religious belief and historical understanding. From suppressed gospels to destroyed libraries, from forged documents to borrowed stories, the manuscripts that survive to the present day represent only a fraction of the knowledge that once existed. The systematic suppression and manipulation of written records reveals how those in power have always understood that controlling information means controlling belief and behavior. By determining which texts are preserved, which are hidden, and which are destroyed, institutions shape not just what people know about the past, but how they understand their present reality. This pattern of documentary control continues in the digital age, where search algorithms, content moderation, and platform policies determine what information reaches public attention. Understanding historical patterns of suppression helps us recognize contemporary forms of information control and maintain appropriate skepticism about official narratives. When we move to our next section about historical figures who have been altered or erased, we'll see how the same institutional forces that control documents also reshape our understanding of the people who created those documents, ensuring that even human personalities and achievements serve the political and religious needs of those who write history. Perhaps no figure in Christian history has been more deliberately transformed than Mary Magdalene. For over 1,400 years, she was portrayed as a repentant prostitute who became a devoted follower of Jesus. But this image was a complete fabrication that erased her true role as one of Christianity's most important leaders. The transformation began in 591 AD, when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon conflating Mary Magdalene with an unnamed sinful woman mentioned elsewhere in the Gospels. This conflation had no biblical basis, but it served to diminish Mary's status and create a cautionary tale about female sexuality and redemption. Here's what the Gospels actually say about Mary Magdalene. She was the first witness to Jesus' resurrection and was specifically chosen to announce this central Christian event to the male disciples. This role earned her the title Apostle to the Apostles in early Christian tradition. Mary appears in all 4 canonical Gospels, often in positions of prominence. She's consistently portrayed as a leader among Jesus' followers, financially supporting his ministry and remaining loyal even when male disciples fled during the crucifixion. The excluded Gospels present an even more dramatic picture of Mary's importance. In the Gospel of Mary, she receives special revelations from Jesus that other disciples cannot understand. When she shares these teachings, Peter objects specifically because she's a woman, revealing early tensions about female religious authority. The Gospel of Philip describes an intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary, stating that Jesus loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth. While the physical nature of this relationship remains debated, it clearly indicates a special bond that threatened later male church hierarchy. Archaeological evidence supports Mary's prominence in early Christianity. Second-century Christian art frequently depicts her in positions of authority, and early Christian communities were sometimes named after her rather than male apostles. The systematic suppression of Mary's leadership role wasn't accidental. As Christianity became institutionalized in the Roman Empire, there was pressure to conform to Greco-Roman social norms that restricted women's public roles. A female religious leader didn't fit the imperial model of male-dominated authority. The prostitute narrative served multiple functions. It provided a dramatic conversion story that emphasized sin and redemption. It created a female figure who was safely subordinated to male authority. And it warned women about the consequences of sexual impropriety while offering hope for redemption through submission. The Catholic Church officially corrected Gregory's error in 1969, nearly 1,400 years after it was created. But by then, the damage was done. Generations of Christians had internalized the image of Mary as a reformed sinner rather than an apostolic leader. Recent scholarship has worked to recover Mary's historical role, but popular imagination still reflects centuries of deliberate misrepresentation. The transformation of Mary Magdalene demonstrates how powerful institutions can reshape historical figures to serve contemporary political and social needs. Modern feminist theologians argue that Mary's suppression represents a broader pattern of eliminating women's voices from Christian history. Her restoration to apostolic status challenges traditional arguments against female religious leadership and suggests that Christianity's original form may have been more gender-inclusive than later developments. For centuries, medieval Europeans believed that a woman had successfully disguised herself as a man, risen through church ranks, and served as pope for over 2 years before being discovered when she gave birth during a papal procession. Pope Joan became one of the most famous figures in medieval Christianity, but her story was systematically suppressed as the Catholic Church gained more control over historical narratives. The legend of Pope Joan first appeared in the 13th century and was widely accepted as historical fact throughout the medieval period. According to the story, Joan was a brilliant woman who disguised herself as a man to receive an education. She eventually became a cardinal and was elected pope around 855 AD, serving as John VIII. Medieval chronicles included Joan in official papal lists, and her story was represented in art, literature, and popular culture throughout Europe. She was mentioned by respected historians and chroniclers who had no apparent reason to fabricate the account. The story claimed that Joan's deception was discovered when she went into labor during a papal procession from St. Peter's to the Lateran. She allegedly gave birth in the street and was either stoned to death by an angry mob or died in childbirth, depending on the version. Some accounts claim that subsequent papal processions avoided the street where Joan gave birth, and that a special chair with a hole was used to verify the gender of new popes before their installation. But starting in the Renaissance, Catholic scholars began systematically challenging Joan's existence. They pointed out that contemporary papal records showed no gaps where Joan could have reigned, and that no reliable contemporary sources mentioned a female pope. The Counter-Reformation intensified efforts to debunk the Joan legend as Protestant propaganda designed to embarrass the Catholic Church. Scholarly analysis revealed inconsistencies in the various accounts and showed that the story appeared centuries after the supposed events. Modern historians generally consider Pope Joan a medieval legend rather than historical fact. The story may have developed from folklore about powerful women or from actual cases of gender deception in religious contexts, but there's no credible evidence for a female pope in the 9th century. However, the systematic suppression of the Joan story reveals important patterns in how religious institutions control historical narratives. Whether Joan existed or not, the mere possibility of female papal authority was so threatening that enormous effort was devoted to eliminating the story from historical consciousness. The Joan legend also reflects medieval anxieties about gender roles and religious authority. Even as a cautionary tale about deception, it suggested that women could successfully perform papal functions, a possibility that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and spiritual leadership. The complete erasure of Joan from popular consciousness demonstrates how effectively institutions can eliminate inconvenient narratives when they gain sufficient control over education and historical interpretation. While Pope Joan was erased for being too controversial, Pope Damasus I was hidden for being too revealing about how early Christianity actually developed. Damasus, who reigned from 366 to 384 AD, was one of the most influential figures in Christian history. But his story has been carefully sanitized to obscure the political machinations that shaped the faith. Damasus didn't become pope through spiritual calling, but through violent political struggle. His election in 366 AD triggered street fighting in Rome between his supporters and those of his rival Ursinus. According to contemporary accounts, 137 people died in these conflicts, revealing that papal elections were deadly political contests rather than peaceful spiritual selections. Once in power, Damasus systematically consolidated Catholic authority through methods that resembled imperial politics more than religious leadership. He was the first pope to consistently claim supreme authority over other bishops, establishing precedents that would define papal power for centuries. Damasus commissioned Jerome to create the Latin Vulgate Bible. But this wasn't just a translation project. It was a deliberate effort to standardize Christian doctrine by controlling which texts were included and how they were interpreted. Damasus effectively determined which books would be considered scriptural and which would be rejected. The Synod of Rome in 382 AD, organized by Damasus, produced one of the first official lists of canonical biblical books. But this wasn't a neutral scholarly exercise. Damasus used the Synod to exclude texts that supported alternative forms of Christianity while promoting books that reinforced papal authority. Damasus also transformed the papacy from a primarily spiritual office into a political institution that could compete with imperial power. He adopted imperial ceremonial practices, established Latin as the official language of the Western Church, and created administrative structures modeled on Roman government. His building projects in Rome were designed to establish Christian supremacy over pagan traditions while asserting papal control over Christian sacred sites. The basilicas he constructed became models for later church architecture and centers of papal power. Contemporary critics accused Damasus of luxury, political corruption, and violence. He was nicknamed the ear-scratcher of matrons for his alleged relationships with wealthy Roman women, and faced charges of adultery that were dismissed only through imperial intervention. The systematic sanitization of Damasus's legacy serves important institutional purposes. The Catholic Church prefers to present early papal development as guided by spiritual rather than political considerations, obscuring the very human struggles for power that actually shaped the institution. Damasus's story reveals how Christianity's transition from persecuted sect to imperial religion involved adopting the same political methods used by secular authorities. The spiritual narrative of papal development conceals the calculated political strategies that established Catholic dominance. Understanding Damasus's actual methods provides insight into how religious institutions consolidate power and control doctrine through political rather than purely spiritual means. One of the most persistent alternative theories about Jesus concerns the possibility that he traveled to India during the missing years between his appearance in the temple at age 12 and the beginning of his public ministry at 30. While mainstream Christianity dismisses this theory, the evidence deserves serious consideration. The theory was first popularized by Nicholas Notovich, a Russian journalist who claimed in 1894 to have discovered ancient texts at the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, describing a young man named Isa who studied with Hindu and Buddhist teachers before returning to Palestine. According to these texts, Isa arrived in India at age 13 and spent years learning from Brahmin priests and Buddhist monks. He allegedly studied meditation, philosophy, and healing techniques while developing the spiritual insights that would later characterize his teaching ministry. The text described Isa challenging the Hindu caste system and advocating for social equality, which eventually forced him to leave India and return to his homeland. This timeline would account for the missing 18 years in Jesus' life that the canonical Gospels don't address. Critics immediately challenged Notovich's claims, pointing out that no monastery official confirmed the existence of the texts he described. Later visitors to Hemis reported that monks denied any knowledge of documents about Isa or Jesus. However, the theory persists because it would explain several puzzling aspects of Jesus' teaching and methodology. Many of his sayings and parables show remarkable similarities to Buddhist and Hindu philosophical concepts that weren't common in first-century Palestine. The Sermon on the Mount contains teachings about non-resistance, love for enemies, and detachment from material wealth that closely parallel Buddhist ethics. The concept of the kingdom of heaven within each person resembles Hindu ideas about the divine presence, Atman, in human consciousness. Jesus' healing methods, use of parables, and emphasis on direct spiritual experience all have parallels in Indian religious traditions. His ability to gather disciples and teach without apparent formal religious education might be explained by training in Indian spiritual schools. Archaeological evidence shows that trade routes connected Palestine with India during Jesus' lifetime. Merchants, scholars, and religious teachers regularly traveled between the regions, making cultural exchange not only possible, but likely. Some scholars argue that similarities between Jesus' teachings and Indian religion could result from common Indo-European cultural roots or later Buddhist influence on early Christianity through missionary activity, rather than requiring Jesus' physical presence in India. The Kashmir region maintains local traditions about a saint named Yusuf, who some believe was Jesus. The Rosa Baal shrine in Srinagar is claimed by some locals to be Jesus' tomb, though this contradicts Christian beliefs about the resurrection and ascension. Modern DNA analysis and archaeological investigation could potentially verify or refute some claims about Jesus' presence in India. But political and religious sensitivities make such research difficult to conduct. Whether Jesus actually traveled to India or not, the theory highlights the multicultural environment of the ancient world and suggests that Christianity's development may have involved more cross-cultural influence than traditional accounts acknowledge. The New Testament's silence about Jesus' life from age 12 to 30 represents one of the most significant gaps in Christian historical records. These missing 18 years coincide with the period when Jesus would have been developing the knowledge, skills, and spiritual insights that enabled him to begin his public ministry as a fully formed religious teacher. The canonical Gospels provide only one incident from this period: Jesus' appearance in the Jerusalem temple at age 12, where he amazed religious scholars with his understanding of Scripture and theology. After this, the Gospels say nothing until Jesus begins his public ministry nearly 2 decades later. This silence is historically puzzling. The Gospels were written to establish Jesus' credentials as a religious teacher and divine figure, so one would expect them to include evidence of his spiritual development and preparation for ministry during these formative years. Traditional Christian interpretation assumes Jesus lived quietly in Nazareth, working as a carpenter and gradually developing his spiritual understanding through prayer and study of Jewish scriptures. But this explanation doesn't account for the sophisticated theological knowledge and teaching methods he displayed when beginning his public ministry. The gap becomes more significant when we consider that Jesus' teachings showed familiarity with diverse philosophical and religious traditions that weren't commonly known in rural Galilee. His parables, healing methods, and spiritual insights suggest exposure to broader cultural influences. Some scholars propose that Jesus may have studied with the Essenes, the Jewish sect that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes practiced communal living, baptism, and apocalyptic beliefs that parallel early Christian teachings. John the Baptist may have provided a connection between Jesus and Essene communities. Another possibility is that Jesus traveled to Alexandria, the ancient world's greatest center of learning. Alexandria housed the famous library and attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. The city's diverse philosophical schools might have influenced Jesus' intellectual development. The absence of information about these years in canonical sources might be deliberate rather than accidental. If Jesus had been influenced by non-Jewish religious traditions or had studied with teachers whose methods conflicted with later Christian orthodoxy, this information might have been suppressed to maintain claims about the divine origin of his teachings. Early Christian communities may have possessed information about Jesus' missing years that was later eliminated when the canonical Gospels were finalized. Alternative sources of information about Jesus' development might have been among the texts that were excluded from the biblical canon. The systematic silence about these crucial years creates space for speculation and alternative theories while preventing verification of Jesus' actual activities and influences during this period. The most profound transformation in Christian history may be the gradual evolution from the historical Jesus of first-century Palestine to the divine Christ of later Christian theology. Understanding this transformation reveals how religious movements can fundamentally alter their founders' original messages and identities. Historical evidence suggests that Jesus was a Jewish rabbi who preached social justice, religious reform, and the imminent arrival of God's kingdom. He operated within Jewish religious and cultural contexts, observing Jewish law and addressing Jewish audiences with messages rooted in Jewish prophetic traditions. The earliest Christian writings, particularly Paul's letters, focus primarily on the theological significance of Jesus' death and resurrection rather than his historical life and teachings. Paul, who never met the historical Jesus, was primarily interested in Christ as a cosmic figure whose sacrifice enabled human salvation. This theological emphasis gradually displaced interest in Jesus' actual biography, teaching methods, and historical context. The Jesus who emerges from later Christian doctrine bears little resemblance to the Jewish teacher who would have been familiar to his original followers. The canonical Gospels, written 30 to 70 years after Jesus' death, blend historical memories with theological interpretations developed by Christian communities over several decades. They present Jesus through the lens of developed Christian doctrine rather than as neutral biographical accounts. The process of theological development transformed Jesus from a Jewish reformer into a universal savior, from a teacher of wisdom into the second person of the Trinity, from a historical person into a cosmic Christ who existed before creation and will return to judge the world. Some scholars suggest this transformation may have reflected changing social attitudes as Christian communities adapted to Greco-Roman cultural contexts, though traditional interpretations offer different perspectives on the development of Mary's portrayal. A Jewish rabbi wouldn't appeal to Gentile audiences, but a divine savior could attract universal devotion. The Hellenization of Christianity involved adopting Greek philosophical concepts that were foreign to Jesus' original Jewish context. Ideas about the Logos, divine nature, and cosmic salvation were grafted onto Jesus' story to make Christianity compatible with Greek intellectual traditions. Political considerations also influenced the transformation. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, there was pressure to present Jesus in ways that supported imperial authority rather than challenging existing power structures. The historical Jesus probably expected God's kingdom to arrive within his lifetime, challenging Roman occupation and religious corruption. Some historians propose that theological developments may have made Christianity more compatible with imperial structures, though believers maintain these changes reflected deeper spiritual truths rather than political accommodation. Archaeological and textual evidence continues to reveal aspects of first-century Palestinian culture that help us understand Jesus' original context. This research often reveals how different the historical Jesus was from later Christian portrayals. The quest for the historical Jesus doesn't necessarily undermine Christian faith, but it does reveal how human interpretation and political needs have shaped religious doctrine over time. Understanding this process helps distinguish between original teachings and later theological developments. The transformation of Jesus into Christ represents one of history's most successful religious adaptations, enabling a Jewish reform movement to become a global religion. But this success came at the cost of obscuring the historical figure whose life inspired the movement. As we examine these altered historical figures, we see a consistent pattern. Religious and political institutions reshape personalities and biographies to serve contemporary needs rather than preserving accurate historical memory. From Mary Magdalene's transformation from leader to prostitute, to the complete erasure of figures like Pope Joan, to the theological transformation of Jesus himself, we see how human personalities become raw material for institutional narratives. This process continues today as contemporary institutions selectively present historical figures in ways that support current agendas. Understanding how this has worked in the past helps us recognize similar processes in the present and maintain appropriate skepticism about official biographical accounts. The figures we've examined represent just a small sample of the historical personalities who have been altered, suppressed, or transformed to serve institutional interests. Each recovered story suggests others that remain hidden, waiting for scholars brave enough to challenge established narratives. When we move to our next section about staged historical events, we'll see how the same institutional forces that alter personalities also manipulate our understanding of major historical occurrences, creating false narratives about the past that serve contemporary power structures. We now shift from altered individuals to events that may have been deliberately staged or manipulated. Our first case takes us to one of the most pivotal moments in Christian history, the vision of Constantine before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. According to the official account, on October 27, 312 AD, Emperor Constantine saw a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer," written in Greek. This vision supposedly convinced him to convert to Christianity and led to Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. The story has two main versions. Lactantius, writing shortly after the events, claimed Constantine received his vision in a dream the night before battle. However, Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, later wrote that the emperor saw the vision in broad daylight, with his entire army as witnesses. Here's where things become suspicious. Eusebius only recorded this more dramatic version decades later, around 337 AD, and claimed Constantine told him personally. No contemporary records from other sources mention thousands of soldiers witnessing a miraculous cross in the sky. Modern historians offer various interpretations of this vision. Some scholars question its historical details while others examine its political implications, though many believers maintain its authentic spiritual significance regardless of historical debate. Consider the political context. Constantine was facing a civil war against Maxentius, who controlled Rome. Constantine needed divine legitimacy for his campaign, and claiming heavenly support would have been a powerful propaganda tool. Archaeological evidence shows that Constantine's soldiers used Christian symbols on their shields at Milvian Bridge. However, some scholars argue these symbols may have been added to existing military standards rather than representing a sudden conversion. Furthermore, Constantine's behavior after his supposed conversion was inconsistent with genuine Christian faith. He continued to hold the pagan title of Pontifex Maximus, delayed his baptism until his deathbed, and executed his own son and wife just years after his conversion. A solar eclipse occurred in 310 AD, just 2 years before the battle. Some researchers suggest Constantine may have witnessed this natural phenomenon and later reinterpreted it as a divine sign when it became politically advantageous. The timing of the story's evolution is also telling. The more miraculous version only emerged after Constantine had secured power and needed to justify his religious policies to increasingly Christian subjects. Whether real or fabricated, Constantine's vision changed the course of world history. If it was indeed staged or exaggerated, it represents one of the most successful propaganda campaigns ever executed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is often presented as a harmonious gathering where church leaders peacefully resolve theological disputes. However, historical evidence suggests this council may have been more of a politically orchestrated event than a genuine theological discussion. Emperor Constantine called the council ostensibly to resolve the Arian controversy, a debate about whether Jesus was fully divine or a lesser being created by God the Father. However, Constantine's real motivation may have been political unity rather than theological truth. Constantine was not even baptized at the time and had limited understanding of Christian theology. Yet he personally presided over the council and significantly influenced its outcomes. This raises questions about whether the decisions were based on theological merit or imperial preference. The traditional narrative claims 318 bishops attended, representing the entire Christian world. However, the actual number was likely closer to 250, and the vast majority came from the Eastern Empire. Western bishops were severely underrepresented, suggesting this was more of a regional council than a truly ecumenical gathering. More troubling is how dissent was handled. Bishops who disagreed with the emerging consensus faced exile and persecution. Arius himself was banished, and his writings were ordered burned. Only 2 bishops ultimately refused to sign the Nicene Creed, suspiciously low for such a contentious theological issue. Contemporary accounts suggest Constantine used a combination of bribes, threats, and political pressure to achieve the desired outcome. Bishops who supported the emperor's preferred position received favorable treatment, while opponents faced consequences. The council also made decisions that extended far beyond theology. Bishops received significant temporal powers, and the church was granted tax exemptions and legal privileges. These benefits created strong incentives for religious leaders to align with imperial wishes. Historically, the council's impact was not immediate. Arianism continued to thrive for decades after Nicaea, suggesting the theological issues were far from resolved. Constantine himself later recalled Arius from exile, indicating his own uncertainty about the decisions made. Some historians argue that the Nicene Creed was less about defining Christian belief than about creating a unified imperial religion that could serve Constantine's political needs. The emphasis on Jesus' divine nature supported the concept of divine imperial authority. The council also established precedents that would shape Christianity for centuries. The idea that emperors could call councils and influence theological decisions created a model of state-controlled religion that persisted long after the Roman Empire's fall. Modern scholars have noted that many crucial theological concepts we associate with early Christianity were actually formalized at Nicaea under political pressure rather than through organic theological development. Documents from the council show extensive editing and revision, suggesting the final creed was carefully crafted to serve multiple political and religious agendas rather than simply reflecting theological consensus. One of history's most famous mass arrests occurred on Friday, October 13th, 1307, when King Philip IV of France simultaneously arrested every Knights Templar in his territory. However, evidence suggests this operation was carefully orchestrated months in advance for political and financial gain. The official reason given was that the Templars were guilty of heresy, blasphemy, and various immoral practices. However, the timing and execution of the arrest reveal a different motive. Philip was deeply in debt to the Templars and saw their destruction as a solution to his financial problems. Sealed orders were distributed to royal officials across France weeks before the arrests, instructing them to act simultaneously on Friday the 13th. This level of coordination suggests extensive planning rather than a response to suddenly discovered heretical activities. The confessions extracted from Templars under torture followed suspiciously similar patterns, indicating they may have been scripted in advance. Many Templars later recanted these confessions when torture stopped, claiming they had said whatever their captors wanted to hear. Philip's propaganda campaign against the Templars began months before the arrests. Anonymous pamphlets appeared throughout France accusing the order of various crimes, suggesting a coordinated effort to prepare public opinion for the upcoming action. The charges themselves seemed designed for maximum public impact rather than theological accuracy. Accusations included spitting on the cross, worshiping a demon called Baphomet, and engaging in homosexual practices, all calculated to scandalize medieval Christian society. Conveniently, when the Templars were arrested, their vast treasury had mysteriously disappeared. Philip claimed they had hidden their wealth, but historians suspect he had already secured it through informants within the order. The international response was telling. Other European monarchs initially refused to arrest Templars in their territories, suggesting they recognized Philip's actions as politically motivated rather than religiously justified. Pope Clement V, who was under significant pressure from Philip, reluctantly supported the arrests, but later expressed private doubts about the charges. His wavering suggests even church leadership questioned the legitimacy of the action. The superstition surrounding Friday the 13th likely stems from this event, demonstrating how a staged political operation created lasting cultural impact. Throughout the medieval period, a systematic campaign was undertaken to rewrite historical records to support the growing power of the Catholic Church. This process, often called pious fraud, involved altering documents, creating fake historical accounts, and destroying inconvenient evidence. One of the most significant examples is the donation of Constantine, which we mentioned earlier. This forged document claimed that Emperor Constantine had given the Pope temporal authority over Western Europe. For centuries, this fabrication was used to justify papal political power. Medieval monasteries, which controlled most written records, systematically edited historical texts to remove references to married priests, female religious leaders, and alternative Christian traditions. Many original documents were destroyed after corrected versions were created. The lives of early saints were extensively rewritten to conform to later theological developments. Historical figures who may have held beliefs considered heretical by medieval standards had their biographies sanitized or completely fabricated. Chronicles of the early church were edited to minimize the diversity of early Christian thought and practice. References to theological debates and alternative interpretations were removed to create an impression of early unity that never actually existed. Archaeological evidence that contradicted official church history was often suppressed or reinterpreted. Sites that suggested different traditions or practices were either destroyed or had their significance minimized in official records. The process was not limited to religious history. Secular historical events were also modified to support the narrative of divine providence guiding Christian rulers. Military defeats were reframed as divine tests, while victories were attributed to heavenly intervention. Modern historians have identified numerous cases where multiple versions of the same events exist, with later versions consistently more favorable to church interests. This suggests systematic rather than accidental alteration of historical records. The series of church councils from the 4th to 8th centuries are often presented as theological gatherings focused on spiritual matters. However, examining them closely reveals they were primarily political events designed to consolidate power and eliminate opposition. The pattern established at Nicaea was repeated at subsequent councils. Emperors or powerful church leaders would call assemblies to address theological issues that were actually political problems in disguise. The outcomes were predetermined based on power relationships rather than theological merit. The Council of Ephesus in 431 AD exemplifies this dynamic. The council was called to address the Nestorian controversy about the nature of Christ, but it quickly devolved into a political struggle between different factions of the church hierarchy. Cyril of Alexandria arrived with a large entourage and significant financial resources, effectively buying influence among the attending bishops. When his opponent Nestorius arrived, Cyril had already secured enough votes to condemn Nestorianism before theological debates even began. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD demonstrated how these gatherings served imperial interests. Emperor Marcian used the council to assert control over the church while appearing to address theological concerns. Bishops who opposed imperial preferences found themselves labeled as heretics. What's particularly revealing is how council decisions often reflected contemporary political situations rather than timeless theological truths. Emperors facing specific challenges would convene councils that miraculously produced theological solutions supporting their political needs. The documentation from these councils shows extensive behind-the-scenes negotiation, bribery, and coercion. Bishops were promised favorable treatment for their dioceses in exchange for votes, while opponents faced exile or worse. Many councils were packed with supporters of predetermined positions. Travel expenses were selectively provided to ensure favorable representation, while potential opponents were discouraged or prevented from attending. The theological language developed at these councils often served to obscure rather than clarify religious issues. Complex formulations that few could understand helped consolidate authority among educated church leaders, while excluding ordinary believers from meaningful participation. Records show that emperors frequently intervened directly in theological discussions, despite lacking religious training. Their preferences consistently aligned with outcomes that strengthened imperial authority over religious matters. The enforcement of council decisions relied heavily on state power rather than religious persuasion. Imperial troops were used to remove bishops who refused to accept council rulings, revealing the political nature of supposedly spiritual decisions. Perhaps most tellingly, many council decisions were later reversed when political circumstances changed. This suggests their theological pronouncements were more contingent on power relationships than on divine revelation. The legacy of these councils extended far beyond their immediate historical context. They established patterns of centralized religious authority and state involvement in theological matters that would shape Christianity for centuries. Modern examination of council records reveals extensive editing and revision of official accounts. The final versions we have today were often sanitized to remove evidence of political manipulation and present a more spiritually focused narrative. As we examine these staged events, a clear pattern emerges. Throughout history, those in power have manipulated religious gatherings, created false narratives, and rewritten records to serve their interests while claiming divine authority. This doesn't necessarily invalidate religious belief, but it does remind us to approach historical claims with appropriate skepticism. Understanding how political power has shaped religious narratives helps us better evaluate the sources of our beliefs and traditions. When we move to our next section about religions that were absorbed or erased, we'll see how this pattern of political manipulation extended to the systematic suppression of alternative spiritual traditions. The staging of historical events represents one of the most sophisticated forms of propaganda. By controlling not just current narratives, but also historical records, powerful institutions have shaped our understanding of the past in ways that serve their continued authority. These examples remind us that history is not simply what happened, but what those with power have chosen to preserve and how they have chosen to present it. True understanding requires us to look beneath official accounts and question whose interests these stories serve. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, it didn't just compete with other religions, it systematically absorbed and erased them, often adopting their practices while denying their origins. One of the most significant casualties was Mithraism, a mystery religion that bore striking similarities to early Christianity. Mithraism was enormously popular among Roman soldiers and government officials from the 1st to 4th centuries AD. Devotees worshiped Mithra, a god of light who was said to have been born from a rock on December 25th. Sound familiar? The parallels between Mithraism and Christianity are remarkable and troubling for traditional Christian narratives. Mithra was called the light of the world and the good shepherd. His followers believed in eternal life, final judgment, and resurrection. They practiced baptism and a form of communion with bread and wine. Mithric temples, called Mithraea, have been found throughout the Roman Empire, including directly beneath several major Christian churches. The famous San Clemente Basilica in Rome sits directly above a Mithraeum, suggesting early Christians literally built their faith on top of Mithric foundations. What makes this particularly significant is the timeline. Many Mithric practices predate Christianity by centuries. Archaeological evidence shows Mithric temples existed in Rome before any Christian churches were built there. The December 25th birth date is especially telling. This date had no biblical basis, appearing nowhere in Christian scripture. However, it perfectly coincided with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which was closely connected to Mithric worship. Early Christian writers were clearly aware of these similarities and felt threatened by them. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, claimed that demons had inspired Mithric rituals to mock Christianity. This defensive response suggests early Christians recognized how closely their religion resembled existing pagan practices. When Christianity became Rome's official religion, Mithraism was suppressed. Its temples were destroyed or turned into Christian churches, texts were burned, and followers were persecuted. Today, most people have never heard of Mithraism. Despite its enormous influence on ancient religion, this erasure was so complete that scholars only began rediscovering Mithric practices through archaeology in the past few centuries. The absorption of Mithric elements into Christianity represents a pattern we'll see repeated throughout this section. Rather than competing directly with popular religious practices, Christianity often adopted them while claiming divine origin for what were actually borrowed traditions. Before Roman Christianity dominated Europe, A unique form of Christianity had developed among the Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Britain. This Celtic Christianity was remarkably different from its Roman counterpart, and its systematic suppression represents one of the great lost opportunities in Christian history. Celtic Christianity emerged in relative isolation from Roman influence, developing its own traditions and practices. Celtic Christians allowed priests to marry, ordained women as priests and bishops, and emphasized mystical experiences over institutional hierarchy. The Celtic Church had a fundamentally different organizational structure. Rather than the Roman system of centralized authority under bishops, Celtic Christianity was organized around monasteries led by abbots or abbesses. Women held positions of significant power, including St. Bridget of Kildare, who was considered equal in authority to St. Patrick. Celtic Christian art and spirituality reflected deep connections to nature and indigenous Celtic traditions. Their illuminated manuscripts, like the Book of Kells, incorporated Celtic knotwork and symbols. Their theology emphasized the presence of God in the natural world, a concept foreign to Roman Christianity. The calculation of Easter was a major point of contention. Celtic Christians used an older calculation method that often resulted in celebrating Easter on different dates than Roman Christians. This wasn't merely a calendar dispute, but reflected deeper theological and cultural differences. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD marked the beginning of the end for independent Celtic Christianity. King Oswiu of Northumbria chose to align with Roman practices rather than Celtic ones, setting a precedent for political leaders throughout the British Isles. What followed was a systematic campaign to absorb or eliminate Celtic Christian practices. Celtic priests were forced to adopt Roman tonsures. Roman liturgies replaced Celtic ones, and married priests were required to abandon their wives or leave the priesthood. The unique Celtic emphasis on scholarly learning was gradually subordinated to Roman institutional authority. Irish monasteries had been among the most advanced centers of learning in Europe, preserving classical texts and developing sophisticated theological concepts. Many Celtic saints were either absorbed into Roman traditions with altered biographies or were quietly forgotten. The rich tradition of Celtic Christian poetry and music was marginalized in favor of Latin hymns and Roman ceremonial practices. The suppression wasn't always violent, but it was thorough. Over several centuries, a vibrant and distinct form of Christianity was transformed into a regional variant of Roman Catholicism, losing most of its unique characteristics in the process. Archaeological evidence suggests Celtic Christian communities maintained some traditional practices in secret for generations after official conversion to Roman customs. Hidden symbols and continued use of Celtic crosses indicate underground resistance to complete assimilation. Today, we can only imagine what Christianity might have looked like if Celtic traditions had been allowed to develop independently, or if synthesis had occurred on more equal terms rather than through systematic suppression. Before Islam emerged in the 7th century, Arabia had a significant Christian population with distinct traditions that differed markedly from both Roman and Byzantine Christianity. These Arabian Christian communities developed unique theological perspectives and practices that were largely erased by subsequent religious and political changes. Arabian Christians included various groups such as the Ghassanids, Lakhmids, and numerous tribal confederations throughout the Arabian Peninsula. They maintained Christian practices while retaining many aspects of traditional Arabian culture, creating a synthesis that was distinctly different from Christianity elsewhere. Many Arabian Christian communities were monophysite or Nestorian, rather than following the Orthodox or Catholic traditions that dominated the Roman Empire. This meant they had different understandings of Christ's nature and rejected the authority of both Rome and Constantinople. These communities used Arabic in their liturgies centuries before Islam, translating Christian texts into Arabic and developing theological concepts in the Arabic language. Some scholars argue this linguistic foundation may have influenced the development of Islamic theology and practice. The rise of Islam dramatically changed the religious landscape of Arabia. While early Islamic rule generally tolerated Christian communities as people of the book, the distinct traditions of Arabian Christianity gradually disappeared through conversion, migration, and cultural pressure. Many Arabian Christian practices and beliefs may have influenced early Islamic development, though this remains a controversial topic. The similarities between certain Christian and Islamic practices in Arabia suggest more interaction and influence than is commonly acknowledged. Archaeological evidence of Arabian Christian communities continues to emerge, revealing a rich religious culture that existed before and during the early Islamic period. These discoveries challenge narratives that present pre-Islamic Arabia as primarily pagan. The complete disappearance of indigenous Arabian Christianity represents the loss of a unique synthesis of Christian faith in Arabian culture that might have offered different perspectives on both religious traditions. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls brought to light a Jewish religious community that may have been closely connected to the origins of Christianity. Yet this group was almost entirely erased from historical records. The Essenes represent one of the most significant missing pieces in understanding early Christian development. Based on the Dead Sea Scrolls and accounts by ancient historians like Josephus and Philo, the Essenes were a Jewish sect that lived in communal settlements, particularly around Qumran near the Dead Sea. They practiced baptism, shared property, and followed a teacher of righteousness who was persecuted by religious authorities. The similarities between Essene practices and early Christianity are striking. Like early Christians, Essenes practiced ritual washing or baptism, held communal meals, and believed in the imminent coming of God's kingdom. They emphasized poverty, celibacy, and separation from mainstream Jewish society. The Essenes produced extensive religious literature, including commentaries on biblical texts, apocalyptic writings, and community rules. Many of these texts show theological concepts that would later appear in Christian writings, suggesting either influence or parallel development. John the Baptist's ministry shows remarkable similarities to Essene practices. His location in the Judean wilderness, emphasis on baptism, and ascetic lifestyle all align with Essene traditions. Some scholars suggest John may have been trained by or associated with the Essenes. The timing is significant. The Essene community at Qumran was active during the exact period when Christianity emerged. Yet after the Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 to 73 AD, the Essenes disappear almost entirely from historical records. This disappearance raises important questions. If the Essenes were so similar to early Christians, why were they erased from Christian tradition? Did early Christian leaders deliberately distance themselves from the Essenes to claim originality for their movement? The systematic exclusion of Essene influence from Christian origin stories may reflect an attempt to present Christianity as entirely new and divinely inspired, rather than as part of a broader Jewish religious development. Acknowledging Essene influence might have undermined claims of Christian uniqueness. Modern scholars increasingly recognize that Christianity emerged from a diverse Jewish religious landscape that included groups like the Essenes. Understanding these connections provides a more complete picture of how Christian beliefs and practices developed. The near-complete erasure of the Essenes from popular historical consciousness demonstrates how effectively inconvenient religious groups can be removed from collective memory, leaving only archaeological evidence to tell their story. Perhaps the most ironic erasure in Christian history is the systematic suppression of Jewish Christianity, the original form of the faith practiced by Jesus' immediate followers. This suppression fundamentally altered the nature of Christianity and represents one of the most significant religious transformations in history. The earliest Christians were Jews who continued to observe Jewish law while believing Jesus was the Messiah. They attended synagogue, kept kosher, circumcised their sons, and observed Jewish festivals. For them, Christianity was a form of Judaism, not a separate religion. The Jerusalem church, led by James, the brother of Jesus, represented this Jewish Christian tradition. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests these communities maintained Jewish practices for centuries after Jesus' death, seeing no contradiction between Jewish law and faith in Jesus. The transformation began with Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Paul argued that non-Jewish converts to Christianity need not follow Jewish law, creating a version of Christianity that was more accessible to the broader Roman world, but fundamentally different from the original Jewish Christian practice. The tension between Jewish and Gentile Christianity created the first major split in the Christian movement. The Acts of the Apostles documents conflicts between Paul and the Jerusalem leadership over whether Gentile converts must be circumcised and follow Jewish dietary laws. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, the Gentile version gradually became dominant, particularly after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jewish Christian communities became increasingly marginalized and were eventually declared heretical by the emerging Orthodox Christian Church. Groups like the Ebionites and Nazarenes maintained Jewish Christian practices for several centuries, but faced persecution from both mainstream Judaism, which rejected their belief in Jesus, and Gentile Christianity, which rejected their continued observance of Jewish law. The irony is profound. The religion founded by a Jewish teacher, initially practiced by Jewish followers according to Jewish customs, eventually declared its own origins to be heretical. This represents one of the most complete religious reversals in history. The suppression of Jewish Christianity had lasting consequences. It severed Christianity's connection to its Jewish roots, contributing to centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. It also eliminated a form of Christianity that might have bridged Jewish and Christian communities. Modern discoveries of Jewish Christian texts and archaeological sites reveal a rich tradition that persisted longer than previously thought. These communities maintain alternative gospels and theological perspectives that were eventually suppressed by Orthodox Christianity. The erasure of Jewish Christianity demonstrates how the winners of religious conflicts rewrite history to make their victory seem inevitable and divinely ordained, obscuring the fact that Christianity could have developed very differently. Beyond entire religious communities, countless individual rituals and practices were absorbed into Christianity, while their origins were systematically erased. This process of religious appropriation was so thorough that many Christians today perform rituals with pagan origins while believing them to be purely Christian innovations. The Christian celebration of Christmas absorbed numerous pagan winter solstice traditions. The date, the use of evergreen trees, gift-giving, and feasting all derived from pre-Christian celebrations like Saturnalia and Germanic Yule festivals. Easter similarly incorporated elements from spring fertility festivals. The name Easter itself comes from Eostre, a Germanic goddess of spring. Easter eggs and rabbits are fertility symbols that predate Christianity by centuries. The practice of canonizing saints absorbed the Roman tradition of honoring household gods and local deities. Many Christian saints replaced pagan gods with similar attributes in areas of protection, maintaining continuity for converted populations. The use of holy water, incense, candles, and bells in Christian worship all have pre-Christian origins in various pagan traditions. These elements were gradually incorporated into Christian practice, while their original meanings were forgotten or suppressed. Even fundamental Christian concepts like the Trinity show influence from earlier religious traditions. The idea of three-in-one deities appeared in various forms throughout the ancient world, from Egyptian theology to Celtic religion. The deliberate erasure of these connections was intentional. Early Christian leaders wanted to present their religion as entirely original and divinely inspired, not as a synthesis of existing traditions. The architectural and ceremonial aspects of Christianity show extensive borrowing from pagan traditions. Yet this heritage has been largely erased from popular understanding. Churches were built on pagan temple sites. Christian ceremonies incorporated pagan elements, and Christian calendar aligned with pagan festivals. The basilica design used for early Christian churches came directly from Roman civil architecture, not from any specifically religious tradition. The orientation of churches toward the east reflected sun worship traditions that Christianity officially rejected. The use of bells to call worshippers and mark religious time came from Celtic and Germanic traditions, where bells were used to ward off evil spirits and mark sacred occasions. Christian adoption of bells maintained the practice while changing the theological justification. Processional ceremonies, the use of vestments, and hierarchical religious organization all showed strong influence from Roman civil and religious practices. The papal institution itself absorbed many aspects of Roman imperial ceremony and authority. The Christian liturgical calendar was carefully aligned with existing pagan festivals to ease the transition for converted populations. This practical approach helped Christianity spread, but also meant absorbing numerous non-Christian elements into Christian practice. The erasure of these connections was so complete that most Christians today are unaware of the extensive pagan heritage embedded in their religious practices. This demonstrates the effectiveness of systematic historical revision in shaping religious consciousness. As we examine these absorbed and erased religions, we see a clear pattern. Christianity's spread involved not just conversion, but cultural appropriation on a massive scale. Existing religious practices were absorbed, reinterpreted, and claimed as Christian innovations while their origins were systematically erased. This process wasn't unique to Christianity. Most successful religions have incorporated elements from previous traditions while claiming divine origin for their practices. However, the scale and thoroughness of Christian appropriation and erasure was remarkable. Understanding these connections doesn't necessarily invalidate Christian faith, but it does provide important context for how religions develop and spread. It also reminds us that religious traditions are more interconnected and influenced by cultural exchange than their official histories usually acknowledge. When we move to our next section about suppressed doctrines, we'll see how this same pattern of erasure was applied not just to other religions, but to alternative forms of Christianity itself. The church that emerged victorious worked systematically to eliminate not just competing religions, but competing interpretations of its own tradition. The absorbed and erased religions represent lost alternatives in human spiritual development. By understanding what was suppressed, we gain insight into both the forces that shaped our current religious landscape and the paths not taken in human spiritual evolution. As Christianity consolidated power, it didn't just absorb competing religions, it also systematically suppressed alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine itself. Perhaps no group faced more thorough persecution than the Gnostics, who claimed to possess secret knowledge about the true nature of reality and salvation. Gnosticism wasn't a single religion, but a diverse collection of Christian sects that shared certain core beliefs. Gnostics taught that the material world was created by a lesser, evil deity called the Demiurge, while the true God remained distant and unknowable. They believed salvation came through secret knowledge, or gnosis, rather than faith alone. This radically different cosmology threatened the emerging Orthodox Christian Church on multiple levels. If the material world was evil, then Jesus couldn't have had a real physical body. If salvation required secret knowledge, then the Church's role as mediator between God and humanity became unnecessary. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, reveal sophisticated theological systems that were far more complex than Orthodox Christianity typically acknowledges. These texts show that early Christianity was far more diverse in its beliefs and practices than later church history suggests. What makes the suppression of Gnosticism particularly significant is how thoroughly it was accomplished. Until the 20th century discoveries at Nag Hammadi, almost everything we knew about Gnosticism came from their Orthodox Christian opponents, who had every reason to misrepresent their beliefs. Early church fathers like Irenaeus wrote extensively against Gnostic teachings, but they often distorted or oversimplified Gnostic positions to make them easier to refute. The discovery of actual Gnostic texts revealed that many Orthodox characterizations were inaccurate or deliberately misleading. The Gnostics also challenged Orthodox Christianity's increasing emphasis on institutional authority. Many Gnostic groups practiced a more egalitarian form of Christianity, where spiritual insight mattered more than ecclesiastical rank. Some groups allowed women to serve as priests and teachers, which threatened the male-dominated Orthodox hierarchy. The theological sophistication of Gnostic thought is remarkable. Groups like the Valentinians developed complex philosophical systems that engaged seriously with Greek philosophy while maintaining Christian identity. Their elimination represented a significant loss of intellectual diversity within Christianity. The methods used to suppress Gnosticism set precedents for dealing with later heresies. Orthodox Christians didn't just argue against Gnostic teachings. They confiscated and burned Gnostic texts, banned Gnostic meetings, and ultimately used imperial power to persecute Gnostic communities. By the 4th century, Gnosticism had been so thoroughly suppressed that it essentially disappeared from the Christian world. This elimination was so complete that modern scholars are still discovering the full extent of Gnostic influence on early Christianity. Beyond Gnosticism, early Christianity contained numerous mystical and esoteric traditions that emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation. These traditions were systematically suppressed as the church developed more rigid hierarchical structures and standardized doctrines. Early Christian mysticism drew heavily from Platonic philosophy and Jewish mystical traditions. Groups of Christians practiced contemplative techniques designed to achieve direct communion with the divine, similar to what we might today call meditation or mystical experience. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi, preserves sayings of Jesus that emphasize inner spiritual knowledge rather than external religious observance. Jesus is quoted as saying, "The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it," suggesting a mystical interpretation of Christian teaching. These mystical traditions often emphasize the divine nature present within human beings, rather than focusing on sin and redemption. This divinization theology suggested that humans could become like God through spiritual practice, a concept that threatened orthodox emphasis on human sinfulness and need for institutional salvation. Many early Christian communities practiced what scholars call charismatic Christianity, emphasizing spiritual gifts like prophecy, healing, and speaking in tongues. As the church became more institutionalized, these spontaneous spiritual expressions were increasingly controlled or suppressed. The Montanist movement of the 2nd century exemplified this tension. Montanists claimed direct revelation from the Holy Spirit and practiced ecstatic prophecy. They were eventually declared heretical, partly because their emphasis on continuing revelation challenged the developing concept of closed scriptural canon. Christian Platonist schools, particularly in Alexandria, developed sophisticated mystical theologies that integrated Greek philosophical concepts with Christian doctrine. Thinkers like Origen taught that souls could achieve mystical union with God through contemplation and spiritual purification. However, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, there was pressure to standardize beliefs and practices. Mystical experiences were difficult to control and could lead to claims of authority that bypassed official church hierarchy. The suppression of Christian mysticism had lasting consequences. It created a form of Christianity that emphasized external observance over internal experience and institutional authority over personal spiritual insight. Many mystical traditions survived only in monasticism or went underground entirely. Eastern Orthodox Christianity preserved more mystical elements than Western Christianity, maintaining traditions like hesychasm that emphasize contemplative prayer and mystical experience. However, even in the East, mystical traditions faced periodic suppression when they challenged institutional authority. The elimination of mainstream Christian mysticism represents a significant narrowing of Christian spiritual possibilities. It created a form of Christianity that was more controllable but arguably less spiritually dynamic than earlier forms. The process of determining which texts would be included in the Christian Bible involved the systematic suppression of numerous alternative scriptures that presented different perspectives on Jesus and early Christianity. Many of these suppressed texts claimed apostolic authorship and were widely used in early Christian communities. The Gospel of Peter, fragments of which survive, presented a docetic view of Jesus that emphasized his divine nature over his humanity. This gospel was popular in some early Christian communities but was eventually rejected because it contradicted the Orthodox position on Christ's nature. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, as we discussed earlier, portrayed Mary as a leading apostle who received special revelations from Jesus. Its suppression reflected not just theological disagreements, but also the increasing marginalization of women's leadership in Christianity. The Acts of Paul and Thecla told the story of a female evangelist who preached, baptized, and served communion. This text was enormously popular in early Christianity, but was eventually suppressed because it depicted female religious authority that the developing Orthodox Church wouldn't accept. Multiple infancy Gospels describe Jesus' childhood with stories of miraculous events and teachings. These texts were beloved by many Christians, but were excluded from the canon partly because they presented a view of Jesus that differed from Orthodox theological developments. The Gospel of the Hebrews was used by Jewish Christian communities and apparently contained sayings and stories of Jesus not found in the canonical Gospels. Its loss represents the suppression not just of alternative texts, but of entire Christian communities whose perspectives differed from emerging Orthodox consensus. Various acts of different apostles describe the missionary activities and teachings of Jesus' followers. Many of these texts contain theological positions that later became controversial, leading to their systematic suppression and eventual loss. The process of canonization wasn't simply about selecting the most historically accurate texts. Political, theological, and practical considerations all played roles in determining which books would be considered authoritative and which would be rejected or forgotten. Church leaders like Athanasius used their authority to promote certain texts while actively campaigning against others. The 39th Festal Letter of Athanasius in 367 AD listed the 27 books that would become the New Testament while explicitly rejecting numerous other texts as unfit for Christian use. The suppression often involved physical destruction of texts. Imperial edicts ordered the confiscation and burning of heretical books, and possession of suppressed texts could result in persecution or death. The result was a significant narrowing of early Christian textual diversity. Modern scholars estimate that we have lost far more early Christian literature than we have preserved, representing viewpoints and communities that were systematically eliminated from Christian tradition. Early Christianity developed in a religiously diverse environment where Eastern philosophical and religious traditions had significant influence throughout the Mediterranean world. However, as Christianity became more institutionalized, these Eastern influences were systematically suppressed or denied. Buddhist missionary activity reached the Mediterranean world centuries before Christianity emerged. The Buddhist emphasis on compassion, nonviolence, and spiritual liberation from suffering showed remarkable parallels to later Christian teachings, suggesting possible influence or at least common spiritual insights. Some scholars have noted striking similarities between the Sermon on the Mount and Buddhist teachings found in texts like the Dhammapada. The emphasis on love for enemies, non-resistance to evil, and concern for the poor all appear in Buddhist literature that predates Christianity. Zoroastrian influence on early Christianity was significant but later downplayed. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic dualism, final judgment, resurrection of the dead, and a savior figure who would defeat evil all appeared in Christianity, yet these connections were systematically obscured. Hindu philosophical concepts, particularly those related to the nature of divinity and the soul's relationship to God, found their way into early Christian mystical traditions. However, as Christianity developed a more rigid theological orthodoxy, these influences were suppressed as incompatible with Christian doctrine. The Hermetic tradition, which synthesized Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern philosophical concepts, was popular among educated Christians in the early centuries. Hermetic ideas about divine knowledge and spiritual transformation influenced Christian mystical thought, but were later condemned as pagan philosophy. Neoplatonic philosophy, which itself incorporated Eastern elements, profoundly influenced early Christian theology. However, as Christianity became more distinctively Western and institutionalized, the acknowledgement of these Eastern philosophical roots was minimized. The suppression of Eastern influences served multiple purposes. It helped Christianity claim uniqueness and divine origin for teachings that may have had broader cross-cultural precedents. It also supported the developing Christian claim to be the sole path to salvation. Manichaeism represented a direct challenge to this exclusivity. This religion, founded by Mani in 3rd century Persia, explicitly synthesized Christian, Buddhist, and Zoroastrian elements. Its success in attracting converts, including Augustine before his conversion to Christianity, demonstrated the appeal of religious synthesis. The systematic persecution of Manichaeism revealed how threatened Orthodox Christianity was by religious traditions that acknowledge multiple sources of spiritual truth. The complete elimination of Manichaeism removed a major alternative that might have offered a more inclusive approach to religious diversity. The denial of Eastern influences in Christian development contributed to the later characterization of Christianity as purely Western and incompatible with Eastern spirituality. This artificial separation ignored the historically cosmopolitan nature of early Christian development. The history of Christian theology is often presented as a gradual clarification of truth through legitimate debate in divine guidance. However, examining the actual historical record reveals that many theological positions were suppressed through political pressure rather than being refuted through genuine intellectual discourse. The Arian controversy, which we discussed earlier in relation to the Council of Nicaea, exemplifies this pattern. Arianism wasn't simply defeated through theological argument, but was suppressed through imperial power and political pressure on bishops. The diversity of views on Christ's nature in early Christianity was remarkable. Beyond Arianism, there were adoptionists who believed Jesus became divine, Docetists who denied his humanity, Nestorians who emphasized the separation of his human and divine natures, and Monophysites who emphasized their unity. Each of these positions had sophisticated theological arguments and biblical support. Their elimination didn't necessarily reflect their theological inadequacy, but rather their incompatibility with imperial political needs for religious unity. The Pelagian controversy over original sin and free will represents another case where political factors determine theological outcomes. Pelagius argued that humans retain the ability to choose good or evil after the fall, while Augustine insisted on complete dependence on divine grace. Pelagius's position was arguably more optimistic about human nature and individual responsibility, but it was condemned partly because it reduced the necessity of church mediation for salvation. The political implications of reducing church authority may have been as important as the theological arguments. The suppression of origenist theology in the 6th century eliminated some of the most sophisticated early Christian thinking about the nature of salvation and the afterlife. Origen had taught that all souls, including demons, would eventually be saved, a position that was later declared heretical. Origen's universalism was supported by careful biblical exegesis and philosophical reasoning, but it was rejected partly because it undermined the Church's use of hell as a tool for social control. The political utility of eternal damnation may have outweighed the theological arguments for universal salvation. The elimination of these diverse theological perspectives created a form of Christianity that was more uniform but arguably less intellectually dynamic. Many creative theological insights were lost when their proponents were declared heretical. The methods used to suppress theological diversity set dangerous precedents. Rather than allowing ideas to compete freely, church authorities used excommunication, exile, and eventually physical persecution to eliminate unwanted perspectives. The pattern established in these early controversies continued throughout Christian history. Theological positions were often judged not primarily on their merits, but on their compatibility with existing power structures and institutional needs. Beyond individual heresies, entire schools of Christian thought were systematically eliminated, representing the loss of sophisticated intellectual traditions that might have enriched Christian theology and practice. The School of Alexandria, founded by Clement and continued by Origen, developed a highly philosophical approach to Christianity that integrated Greek learning with Christian faith. This school produced some of the most intellectually sophisticated early Christian theology. Alexandrian Christianity emphasized allegorical interpretation of Scripture, the essential goodness of creation, and the possibility of spiritual progress through education and contemplation. Their approach attracted educated converts and demonstrated Christianity's intellectual respectability. However, the Alexandrian school's openness to Greek philosophy and its optimistic view of human potential eventually brought it into conflict with more conservative Christian authorities. The condemnation of Origenism in the 6th century effectively ended this theological tradition. The School of Antioch developed a contrasting approach that emphasized literal biblical interpretation and the historical reality of Jesus' human nature. While this school wasn't entirely suppressed, many of its distinctive emphases were marginalized after some of its leaders were associated with Nestorianism. Syrian Christianity developed unique theological traditions that synthesized Christian doctrine with Syriac cultural elements. These traditions produced distinctive liturgies, theological concepts, and spiritual practices that differed significantly from both Eastern and Western Christianity. The systematic Hellenization of Christianity marginalized these Syriac traditions, treating them as culturally inferior rather than as legitimate theological alternatives. The result was a significant loss of Christian diversity and cultural adaptation. Monasticism preserved some alternative theological traditions, but even monastic theology faced periodic suppression when it challenged ecclesiastical authority. The Massalian movement, which emphasized prayer over sacraments, was condemned despite its deep spirituality. The Celtic Church, as we discussed earlier, developed distinctive theological emphases that integrated Christian faith with Celtic culture and spirituality. The suppression of Celtic Christianity eliminated a unique synthesis that might have offered alternative models for Christian development. Gothic Christianity, developed among Germanic peoples, created theological concepts and practices adapted to Germanic culture. The systematic Romanization of Germanic Christianity eliminated these indigenous developments in favor of imported Roman traditions. The loss of these schools of thought represents more than just intellectual diversity. Each tradition offered different approaches to fundamental questions about God, salvation, human nature, and Christian practice. Their elimination narrowed the range of Christian possibilities. Modern Christianity might be significantly different if these alternative schools had been allowed to develop and contribute to ongoing theological discussion rather than being suppressed as threats to institutional unity. The pattern of suppressing intellectual diversity in favor of institutional conformity established precedents that would shape Christianity throughout its history, generally favoring administrative convenience over theological creativity. As we examine these suppressed doctrines, we see how the Christianity that emerged victorious was shaped as much by what it eliminated as by what it preserved. The systematic suppression of alternative Christian traditions created a more uniform, but arguably less rich religious tradition. The methods used to suppress doctrinal diversity established patterns that would be repeated throughout Christian history whenever new theological perspectives challenged established authority. The preference for institutional unity over intellectual diversity became a defining characteristic of mainstream Christianity. This doesn't necessarily invalidate Orthodox Christian faith, but it does reveal how political and social factors, not just theological ones, shape the development of Christian doctrine. Understanding this history helps us recognize that the Christianity we know today represents one possible path among many that might have been taken. When we move to our next section about gender and power, we'll see how these same patterns of suppression were applied specifically to women's roles and voices in Christianity, eliminating not just alternative doctrines, but entire categories of religious experience and authority. The suppressed doctrines represent lost alternatives in Christian development, paths not taken that might have led to very different forms of Christian faith and practice. Their elimination was so thorough that most Christians today are unaware of the rich diversity that once existed within their own tradition. Perhaps no aspect of Christian history has been more systematically suppressed than the prominent leadership roles women held in early Christianity. The deliberate erasure of female authority represents one of the most significant transformations in Christian development and reveals how gender politics shaped religious doctrine. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that women held positions of significant authority in early Christian communities. Inscriptions from the first few centuries refer to women as presbyters, deacons, and even bishops. The Theodora Episcopa mosaic in Rome's Church of St. Praxedes shows a woman with a square halo reserved for living persons, suggesting she held episcopal rank. The New Testament itself preserves evidence of female leadership, despite later editorial efforts to minimize it. Phoebe is called a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, using the same Greek word applied to male deacons. Junia is described as prominent among the apostles, though later translations changed her name to the masculine Junias to avoid acknowledging a female apostle. Priscilla appears to have been a church leader who instructed other Christians, including the eloquent Apollos. In several New Testament references, she is mentioned before her husband Aquila, suggesting she held higher status or authority within the Christian community. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, though eventually excluded from the biblical canon, describes a female evangelist who preached, baptized, and administered communion. This text was enormously popular in early Christianity, indicating widespread acceptance of female religious authority. Archaeological evidence from early Christian burial sites shows women with titles like presbytera and episcopa. While later interpreters tried to explain these as merely indicating wives of male clergy, the linguistic evidence suggests these women held these offices in their own right. The Montanist movement of the 2nd century featured prominent female prophets like Prisca and Maximilla, who were considered equal to their male counterparts in receiving divine revelation. The suppression of Montanism eliminated one of the most visible examples of female religious leadership. Early Christian communities often met in homes, and since women typically managed household affairs, they naturally assumed leadership roles in these domestic churches. As Christianity moved from house churches to public basilicas, women lost this organizational advantage. The transformation wasn't immediate, but occurred gradually over several centuries. Women's leadership was progressively restricted, first informally through social pressure, and later through official church legislation that banned women from ordained ministry. The justifications for excluding women from leadership were often retrofitted to existing practices rather than reflecting original Christian teaching. Paul's apparently restrictive statements about women's roles may have been responses to specific local situations rather than universal principles. The systematic erasure of female authority created a historical narrative that made male-only leadership appear natural and divinely ordained, rather than the result of gradual political and social changes within the Christian movement. Despite official church policies restricting women's ordination, evidence suggests that female clergy continued to exist throughout Christian history, operating either in recognition of local necessity or in defiance of ecclesiastical authority. Byzantine sources document women serving as deacons well into the medieval period. The rite for ordaining deaconesses was nearly identical to that used for male deacons, suggesting these were genuine ordinations rather than mere ceremonial appointments. In Celtic Christianity, women served as abbesses with authority equal to bishops, presiding over double monasteries that included both male and female religious communities. Abbesses like Hilda of Whitby held significant political and religious power, hosting church councils and influencing theological decisions. Medieval records reveal women performing priestly functions in various contexts. In remote areas where male priests were unavailable, women sometimes celebrated Mass and administered sacraments, with apparent acceptance from their communities if not from church hierarchy. The Cathars, a medieval religious movement, eventually suppressed as heretical, regularly ordained women as ministers. Their perfecti held equal status with male perfecti and performed all religious functions, including preaching and administering spiritual consolation. Some medieval mystics effectively functioned as religious authorities despite lacking official ordination. Women like Hildegard of Bingen corresponded with popes and emperors, offered theological opinions, and exercised influence that rivaled many male clergy. Beguine communities in medieval Europe created semi-religious societies where women lived in community, cared for the sick, and engaged in spiritual practices without taking formal vows. These communities operated with considerable independence until they were suppressed for being too autonomous. Archaeological evidence from medieval Europe occasionally reveals women buried with symbols of clerical authority, suggesting some women may have held ordained positions that were later forgotten or deliberately obscured from historical records. The Protestant Reformation initially opened some possibilities for expanded women's roles, with some reform movements allowing female preaching and teaching. However, most Protestant denominations eventually institutionalized restrictions similar to those in Catholic tradition. Quaker communities from the 17th century onward recognized women as ministers and preachers, believing that the Holy Spirit could speak through anyone, regardless of gender. This represented a return to early Christian practices that mainstream Christianity had abandoned. Even in traditions that officially excluded women from ordained ministry, women often exercised significant religious authority through other means. Mother superiors, religious founders, and mystics wielded considerable influence despite their unofficial status. The persistence of female religious leadership, despite systematic opposition, suggests a continuous tradition that was repeatedly suppressed rather than naturally disappearing. This pattern indicates that the exclusion of women required constant enforcement rather than reflecting universal acceptance. Before Christianity's rise, fertility rituals and worship of feminine divine figures were central to religious practice throughout the Mediterranean world. The systematic suppression of these traditions represents not just religious change, but a fundamental shift in how societies understood the sacred feminine. Goddess worship was widespread in the ancient world, with figures like Isis, Demeter, Cybele, and Diana commanding enormous devotion. These deities were associated with fertility, childbirth, agriculture, and the cycles of life and death that governed human existence. Many goddess temples served as centers of learning and healing, with female priestesses providing medical care, education, and spiritual guidance. The Temple of Isis in Rome was particularly influential, attracting devotees from across the empire and offering initiation into mystery religions. Fertility rituals connected human sexuality and reproduction to cosmic forces and seasonal cycles. These ceremonies weren't considered immoral, but were seen as sacred acts that maintained harmony between human communities and natural world. The suppression of fertility religions wasn't primarily theological, but reflected changing social attitudes toward sexuality, gender roles, and religious authority. Christianity's emphasis on celibacy and its association of sexuality with sin created direct conflict with fertility-centered spirituality. Sacred prostitution, while perhaps exaggerated by later Christian polemicists, represented a fundamentally different understanding of sexuality as a pathway to divine encounter rather than as a source of sin and corruption. The transformation of goddess figures into Christian saints reveals the persistence of popular devotion to feminine divine figures. Many Marian shrines were built on former goddess temple sites, suggesting continuity of sacred geography and feminine spiritual focus. However, the Virgin Mary, while revered, was carefully constructed to avoid the sexual power associated with ancient goddesses. Her perpetual virginity ensured she couldn't serve as a model for female sexual autonomy or fertility spirituality. The witch trials of the medieval and early modern periods specifically targeted women who maintained knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery, and folk healing practices that connected them to older traditions of feminine spiritual authority. These trials weren't primarily about devil worship, but represented systematic efforts to eliminate alternative sources of female power and knowledge that operated outside Christian institutional control. The characterization of pre-Christian feminine spirituality as demonic or primitive served to justify its suppression while obscuring the sophisticated theological and philosophical systems that had supported goddess worship. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the extent of goddess worship in ancient Europe, suggesting that feminine spiritual traditions were more central to pre-Christian religion than later historical accounts acknowledge. The suppression of fertility spirituality created forms of Christianity that were disconnected from natural cycles and often hostile to bodily experience and sexuality, representing a significant departure from earlier religious attitudes. Throughout Christian history, numerous women achieved remarkable spiritual, intellectual, or leadership accomplishments that were subsequently minimized, misattributed, or entirely erased from popular memory. Recovering these hidden figures reveals a parallel history of female achievement within Christianity. Many early female martyrs were transformed in later hagiography to emphasize their purity and passivity rather than their courage and active resistance to persecution. The original accounts often portrayed them as bold leaders who confronted authorities rather than merely suffering victims. Female theologians and scholars were frequently overlooked or had their work attributed to male colleagues. Recent scholarship has identified women who contributed significantly to theological development, but whose names were removed from historical records. The Desert Mothers, female hermits and ascetics who paralleled the famous Desert Fathers, developed sophisticated spiritual practices and attracted followers. However, their stories were preserved in far fewer manuscripts and received less attention from later chroniclers. Syncletica of Alexandria and other female monastic leaders created theological works and spiritual guidance that influenced early Christian spirituality. But their writings were often attributed to male authors or simply forgotten. Medieval female mystics like Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Julian of Norwich, and Catherine of Siena produced profound theological works, but their contributions were often marginalized as merely experiential rather than intellectually significant. Female rulers who promoted Christianity and influenced church development were frequently reduced to stereotypes of pious queens, rather than being recognized as theological and political leaders who shaped Christian history. The systematic exclusion of women from formal education meant that many female religious thinkers operated outside official channels, making their contributions easier to overlook or suppress in later historical accounts. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals women who held significant religious authority, but whose stories didn't survive in textual records. Burial goods and inscriptions sometimes provide the only evidence of their prominence. Convents and female religious communities preserved many female saints and scholars whose reputations remained local rather than achieving universal recognition, suggesting a much larger population of accomplished women than official records indicate. The process of canonization historically favored male candidates and emphasized certain types of sanctity that were more easily attributed to men, systematically excluding female models of holiness that didn't fit prescribed patterns. Even when women achieved recognition, their stories were often edited to conform to idealized gender roles, obscuring their actual personalities, achievements, and methods of exercising religious authority. Before the rise of patriarchal monotheism, many ancient religious systems featured balanced gender authority, with male and female divine figures sharing power and different but complementary religious roles for men and women. Understanding these systems reveals how dramatically Christianity altered previous religious gender dynamics. Egyptian religion featured powerful goddesses like Isis and Hathor alongside male deities, with female pharaohs occasionally ruling as divine representatives. Religious authority was distributed between male and female priesthoods with different but equally important functions. Mesopotamian religions included prominent goddesses like Inanna and Ishtar, who wielded power over love, war, and fertility. Female priestesses served these deities and held significant social and religious authority within their communities. Greek mystery religions often featured paired male and female deities and required both male and female initiates for complete spiritual development. The Eleusinian mysteries, centered on Demeter and Persephone, were among the most important religious institutions in the ancient world. Celtic religion, before Christian conversion, featured powerful goddesses and female druids who served as judges, healers, and spiritual advisors. Archaeological evidence suggests gender roles were more flexible, and women held various forms of religious and political authority. Germanic tribes had female seers and priestesses who were consulted before major decisions and held significant influence over tribal affairs. These women combined religious, medical, and judicial functions that later Christianity separated and masculinized. Roman religion included the Vestal Virgins, female priests who maintained the sacred fire and whose religious authority was so respected that they could pardon condemned criminals and influence political decisions. The suppression of dual-gender religious authority wasn't immediate, but occurred gradually as Christianity gained influence. Traditional priestesses were initially tolerated, but gradually marginalized and eventually eliminated. The transformation involved not just excluding women from religious leadership, but also eliminating feminine aspects of divinity from religious consciousness. The rich theological symbolism of feminine divine figures was reduced to a single, carefully controlled Marian devotion. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some regions, female religious authority persisted longer than official Christian histories acknowledge, with women continuing traditional practices in rural areas where church control was weaker. The loss of dual-gender religious authority created forms of Christianity that were less equipped to address women's spiritual needs and experiences, contributing to ongoing tensions about women's roles within religious communities. Modern feminist theology has attempted to recover some balance by emphasizing feminine imagery for God and women's religious experience, but this remains controversial within traditional Christian communities. The systematic exclusion of women from Christian religious authority was neither immediate nor inevitable, but resulted from deliberate theological, legal, and social policies implemented over several centuries. Understanding this process reveals how religious doctrine was shaped by cultural prejudices rather than divine mandate. Early Christian restrictions on women's participation often reflected local cultural norms rather than universal Christian principles. Paul's instructions about women's behavior in church address specific situations in particular communities rather than establishing permanent theological positions. The gradual institutionalization of Christianity created pressure to conform to Roman social norms that restricted women's public roles. As Christianity sought respectability within Roman society, it adopted patriarchal structures that hadn't necessarily characterized earlier Christian communities. Theological justifications for excluding women were developed retroactively to support existing practices rather than driving the exclusion itself. Arguments about women's spiritual inferiority or inherent sinfulness were constructed to rationalize predetermined social arrangements. The influence of Greek philosophical traditions that viewed women as intellectually and morally inferior provided intellectual frameworks for Christian theologians to justify restricting women's religious roles. Legal codes increasingly formalized women's exclusion from ordained ministry, transforming what had been informal social pressure into official church law. The development of canon law systematically eliminated the flexibility that had allowed women's leadership in earlier periods. The association of women with sexuality and bodily temptation in Christian theology created theological barriers to women's participation in supposedly spiritual activities like celebrating Mass or preaching. Economic factors also played a role, as church positions became sources of income and social status that men were reluctant to share with women. The professionalization of clergy created competition for positions that had economic as well as spiritual significance. The suppression of female religious authority required constant enforcement and faced ongoing resistance. Women continued to find ways to exercise religious influence through mysticism, religious founding, and informal leadership despite official restrictions. Alternative Christian movements that maintained women's religious authority were systematically suppressed, eliminating examples that might have challenged the developing orthodoxy about appropriate gender roles. The exclusion became so naturalized over time that later generations couldn't imagine Christianity having ever included female religious authority, making the historical evidence seem anomalous rather than representing legitimate Christian tradition. As we examine the systematic exclusion of women from religious authority, we see how social and political factors shaped theological development in ways that profoundly altered Christianity's character and possibilities. The suppression of women's religious leadership represents not just the loss of individual opportunities, but the elimination of entire approaches to spirituality and religious community that might have developed differently under female influence. The gender restrictions that became central to traditional Christianity weren't inevitable features of the religion, but resulted from specific historical circumstances and deliberate policy choices that could have been made differently. Understanding this history doesn't necessarily require changing current religious practices, but it does reveal how human cultural factors influenced what many believers consider divine will, suggesting greater flexibility in religious gender roles than traditional narratives acknowledge. When we move to our next section about mythology and paganism, we'll see how the same patterns of suppression were applied to non-Christian religious traditions, often targeting their feminine elements most aggressively as threats to patriarchal Christian authority. The hidden history of gender and power in Christianity reveals alternative possibilities that were systematically eliminated, creating forms of religious life that might have been very different if women's leadership and feminine spirituality had been allowed to develop alongside masculine traditions. This suppression was so thorough that recovering women's religious history requires archaeological and textual detective work to uncover evidence that was deliberately obscured or destroyed, demonstrating the systematic nature of the erasure. One of the most mysterious and deliberately obscured aspects of biblical narrative involves the Nephilim, The giants mentioned in Genesis, who were said to be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. This story has been systematically downplayed or allegorized away by mainstream Christianity, yet it appears to describe events that ancient audiences took literally. The book of Genesis states that the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, described as the heroes of old, men of renown. These beings were apparently so problematic that they contributed to God's decision to flood the earth. The Book of Enoch, which was considered scripture by early Christians and is still canonical in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, provides extensive detail about these watchers who descended from heaven. According to Enoch, these beings taught humans forbidden knowledge including metallurgy, cosmetics, weapons making, and astronomical secrets. What makes this particularly intriguing is that similar stories appear in mythologies worldwide. Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki, divine beings who came from the heavens and interacted with humans. Greek mythology tells of titans and gods who mated with mortals, producing heroic offspring. Hindu texts describe the asuras and various divine beings who descended to earth. The systematic suppression of these narratives in mainstream Christianity may reflect discomfort with their implications. If taken literally, they suggest that human history involved intervention by non-human intelligences, a concept that doesn't fit neatly into modern theological frameworks. Archaeological discoveries have occasionally uncovered unusually large skeletal remains that don't match typical human proportions. While most can be explained by medical conditions or measurement errors, some anomalous finds have sparked speculation about whether ancient accounts of giants might have some basis in reality. The Smithsonian Institution has been accused by some researchers of systematically suppressing evidence of giant skeletons found in North American archaeological sites. While these claims are largely unsupported by credible evidence, they reflect ongoing public fascination with the possibility that ancient accounts of giants might be more than mythology. More significantly, the Nephilim narrative raises questions about the nature of early human civilization. If ancient peoples worldwide independently developed similar stories about divine beings teaching forbidden knowledge, this might reflect actual historical events that have been mythologized over time. The deliberate marginalization of these biblical passages in modern Christianity represents a form of internal censorship, where inconvenient scriptural content is minimized to maintain theological consistency with contemporary worldviews. The story of Atlantis, first recorded by Plato around 360 BC, has captivated human imagination for over 2 millennia. However, what's often overlooked is how this account, along with similar stories from around the world, may preserve memories of actual advanced ancient civilizations that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to acknowledge. Plato's account in the Timaeus and Critias describes Atlantis as a powerful maritime civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time, placing it around 9,600 BC. According to Plato, Atlantis possessed advanced technology, sophisticated architecture, and a complex political system before being destroyed in a single day and night. Modern archaeology generally dismisses Atlantis as Plato's philosophical allegory rather than historical account. However, this dismissal may be premature given recent discoveries that suggest human civilization is far older and more sophisticated than previously believed. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9,500 BC, demonstrates that hunter-gatherer societies were capable of creating complex megalithic structures with sophisticated astronomical alignments. This predates Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and suggests advanced organizational capabilities in prehistoric societies. Underwater archaeology has revealed numerous submerged structures around the world that may represent settlements flooded by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Sites off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean show architectural features that suggest sophisticated construction techniques. The Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions around 10,800 BC, coincides roughly with Plato's time frame for Atlantis' destruction. This climate catastrophe would have caused massive flooding and could have destroyed advanced coastal civilizations, leaving only fragmentary memories preserved in later mythologies. Indigenous traditions worldwide contain stories of great floods and lost civilizations. The Hindu Puranas describe advanced previous ages. Sumerian texts mention antediluvian cities, and Native American traditions speak of earlier worlds that were destroyed by cataclysms. Dismissing these traditions as mere mythology may reflect academic bias rather than objective analysis. Western scholarship has often been reluctant to acknowledge sophisticated pre-Columbian or pre-classical civilizations, particularly those that might challenge conventional timelines of human development. Recent discoveries like the Antikythera mechanism demonstrate that ancient Greeks possessed technological knowledge far more advanced than previously recognized. If one ancient civilization could develop such sophisticated devices, others might have achieved similar or greater technological advancement. The possibility that advanced civilizations existed before recorded history and were destroyed by natural catastrophes doesn't require accepting every claim about Atlantis, but it does suggest that human prehistory may be more complex and interesting than conventional archaeology acknowledges. Ancient religious and mythological texts contain descriptions of technology and phenomena that seem to exceed the supposed capabilities of their civilizations. While these are usually interpreted metaphorically, some researchers suggest they might represent actual technological knowledge that has been lost or deliberately suppressed. The Sanskrit epics, particularly the Mahabharata and Ramayana, describe vimanas, flying vehicles with remarkable capabilities. These texts provide detailed specifications for construction, fuel systems, and operational procedures that read more like technical manuals than mythological poetry. The Ramayana describes Ravana's Pushpaka Vimana as capable of traveling between continents at tremendous speed. The Mahabharata mentions weapons with effects resembling nuclear explosions, complete with descriptions of radiation sickness and environmental contamination that parallel modern nuclear warfare effects. Ezekiel's vision in the Hebrew Bible describes a complex mechanical device with wheels, propulsion systems, and advanced materials that some researchers interpret as a description of an extraterrestrial spacecraft rather than a mystical vision. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humans advanced metallurgy, astronomy, and mathematics thousands of years before these sciences were supposedly developed. These descriptions suggest technological knowledge that seems anachronistic for the time periods in question. Egyptian texts describe the gods possessing advanced knowledge of chemistry, engineering, and astronomy. The precision of pyramid construction and the sophistication of mummification techniques suggest applied scientific knowledge that may have exceeded what we traditionally attribute to ancient civilizations. Mayan and Aztec texts describe advanced astronomical calculations and engineering projects that required sophisticated mathematical knowledge. Their calendar systems demonstrate understanding of celestial mechanics that rivals modern astronomy. The deliberate allegorization of these technological descriptions in religious interpretation may reflect discomfort with their implications. If ancient peoples actually possessed advanced technology, this would challenge conventional understanding of human technological development as a linear progression. Some researchers suggest that advanced technology might have been deliberately suppressed or lost during various historical catastrophes. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria and similar institutions could have eliminated technological knowledge that took centuries to redevelop. The pattern of interpreting detailed technical descriptions as purely symbolic or mythological may represent a form of academic bias that prevents serious investigation of these ancient accounts as potentially historical records. The vision described in the first chapter of Ezekiel represents one of the most detailed and puzzling passages in biblical literature. Modern analysis of this text has raised questions about whether the prophet was describing a mystical experience or an encounter with advanced technology that he lacked vocabulary to describe accurately. Ezekiel describes seeing a whirlwind coming from the north, with flashing lights and what appears to be a metallic craft containing 4 living creatures with multiple faces and wings. The craft had wheels within wheels that could move in any direction, and above it was a crystal-like dome supporting a throne. NASA engineer Joseph Blumrich analyzed Ezekiel's description and concluded that it matches the design specifications of a spacecraft with rotorcraft capabilities. His technical analysis suggested that Ezekiel's account describes a functional aerospace vehicle using principles consistent with modern engineering. The precision of Ezekiel's description is remarkable. He provides specific measurements, describes the appearance of different materials, and notes behavioral characteristics of the craft that suggest systematic observation rather than mystical hallucination. The four living creatures could represent the landing legs or support mechanisms of a spacecraft, while the wheels within wheels might describe gyroscopic or rotational propulsion systems. The crystal dome and throne could represent a command module or observation deck. Ezekiel's encounter occurred during the Babylonian exile, a period when Jewish prophets were exposed to Mesopotamian astronomical and technological knowledge. However, even advanced Mesopotamian science doesn't adequately explain the sophisticated technology described in his vision. The traditional theological interpretation of Ezekiel's vision as a manifestation of God's glory may have served to prevent serious analysis of its technological implications. By categorizing it as purely spiritual, scholars avoided confronting its possible physical reality. Similar descriptions appear in other ancient texts, suggesting that Ezekiel's experience wasn't unique. The consistency of certain technological details across different cultures and time periods raises questions about whether these accounts describe actual encounters with advanced technology. The systematic avoidance of technological interpretation in biblical scholarship may reflect institutional reluctance to consider possibilities that would challenge conventional understanding of ancient history and religious experience. Modern UFO researchers have noted similarities between Ezekiel's account and contemporary reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, suggesting that whatever Ezekiel witnessed might represent a recurring phenomenon rather than a unique historical event. Creation myths from around the world share remarkably similar elements that may preserve memories of actual cosmic events or terrestrial catastrophes. The systematic classification of these accounts as purely mythological may have obscured their potential value as historical records of dramatic changes in Earth's environment or human civilization. The Mesopotamian Enuma Elish describes a cosmic battle between order and chaos that results in the creation of the current world order. Marduk defeats Tiamat in a conflict involving advanced weapons and cosmic forces that reshape the heavens and earth. Similar themes appear in Greek mythology with the Titanomachy, Norse Ragnarok, Hindu descriptions of cosmic cycles, and Egyptian accounts of Set's conflict with Osiris. These stories consistently describe periods of chaos followed by the establishment of new cosmic orders. Many creation myths describe multiple previous worlds or ages that were destroyed by various catastrophes, including floods, fires, and cosmic disruptions. The Hopi describe 4 previous worlds. Hindu texts outline cosmic cycles of creation and destruction, and Aztec mythology details multiple suns or ages. The biblical account of the Nephilim and the flood can be understood within this same framework of cosmic conflict and catastrophic renewal. The battle between divine and demonic forces results in the destruction of the antediluvian world and the establishment of the current order. Archaeological evidence increasingly supports the occurrence of major catastrophic events in human prehistory. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that cosmic impacts around 10,800 BC caused dramatic climate change and possibly the extinction of megafauna and advanced Ice Age civilizations. Evidence for massive flooding at the end of the last ice age appears in geological records worldwide. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests that the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus around 5600 BC, creating the Black Sea and flooding extensive coastal settlements. Astronomical observations reveal that Earth has experienced numerous cosmic impacts throughout its history. The discovery of impact craters and analysis of cosmic debris suggests that major celestial events occurred within the time frame of human civilization. The possibility that creation myths preserve memories of actual catastrophic events doesn't require accepting every detail literally, but it does suggest that these stories may contain more historical information than conventional interpretation acknowledges. The systematic classification of these accounts as purely symbolic may reflect academic reluctance to consider that human civilization has experienced dramatic disruptions that have been largely forgotten, except in mythological form. Understanding creation myths as potential historical records, rather than mere poetry, might provide insights into human prehistory and help explain the remarkable consistency of catastrophic themes across unconnected cultures worldwide. As we examine these suppressed aspects of mythology and ancient texts, we see a pattern of a systematic avoidance of their possible literal or historical content. Whether describing giants, lost civilizations, advanced technology, or cosmic catastrophes, mainstream scholarship has generally preferred allegorical interpretation over serious investigation of these accounts as potential historical records. This avoidance may reflect legitimate skepticism about extraordinary claims, but it might also represent institutional bias against possibilities that would require substantial revision of conventional historical and scientific paradigms. The secrets hidden in mythology and ancient texts don't necessarily validate every alternative theory about human prehistory, but they do suggest that our ancestors may have experienced and preserved memories of events far more dramatic and significant than conventional history acknowledges. When we move to our final content section about science, power, and control, we'll see how modern institutions continue the same patterns of information suppression that have characterized human civilization throughout history, potentially hiding contemporary secrets that may be as significant as the ancient ones we've explored. The study of suppressed mythology and paganism reveals that the control of narrative and interpretation has always been a tool of power, used to shape not just what people believe about the present, but also what they understand about their own past and origins. The systematic suppression of scientific knowledge didn't begin in the modern era, but has ancient roots in the deliberate control of information by religious and political authorities. Understanding these historical patterns reveals how knowledge suppression has long been used as a tool of power and social control. The Library of Alexandria, as we discussed earlier, represented the ancient world's greatest concentration of scientific and technical knowledge. Its gradual decline and eventual destruction eliminated countless works on mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and medicine that might have accelerated human technological development by centuries. Ancient Greek and Roman scientists made remarkable discoveries that were later forgotten or actively suppressed. Hero of Alexandria invented a primitive steam engine in the 1st century AD, but this technology wasn't developed further, possibly because it threatened existing economic systems based on slave labor. The Antikythera mechanism shows that ancient Greeks had advanced astronomical and engineering knowledge. This bronze computer could predict eclipses and planetary positions with remarkable accuracy, suggesting scientific capabilities far beyond what traditional histories acknowledge. Ancient medical knowledge was often suppressed when it conflicted with religious beliefs about the body and soul. Dissection of human bodies was banned in many societies, limiting anatomical understanding and medical advancement for centuries. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge was sometimes restricted to priestly classes who used it to maintain authority over agricultural and religious calendars. The ability to predict celestial events gave religious authorities significant power over populations who didn't understand these natural phenomena. Alchemical knowledge, while often dismissed as pseudoscience, included sophisticated understanding of chemistry and metallurgy. The deliberate obscuring of alchemical texts through symbolic language may have been necessary to protect practitioners from religious persecution. The transition from oral to written transmission of knowledge created new opportunities for suppression. Written texts could be more easily destroyed or controlled than oral traditions, allowing authorities to eliminate inconvenient scientific knowledge more effectively. Contemporary patterns of information suppression continue ancient traditions of controlling knowledge to maintain power structures and social stability. Modern governments, corporations, and institutions regularly conceal scientific findings that might alarm the public or threaten existing economic and political arrangements. Environmental data about climate change, pollution levels, and ecosystem collapse has been systematically suppressed or downplayed by corporate and government interests for decades. Oil companies possessed accurate climate models in the 1970s, but funded disinformation campaigns to prevent public awareness of climate risks. Medical research that threatens pharmaceutical profits is often suppressed or marginalized. Studies showing the effectiveness of low-cost treatments or the dangers of profitable drugs face systematic obstacles to publication and dissemination. Nuclear industry accidents and radiation exposure data have been consistently underreported or classified to prevent public alarm. The full extent of radiation releases from events like Chernobyl, Fukushima, and numerous smaller incidents remains hidden from public view. Military research into advanced propulsion systems, energy technologies, and materials science is classified at levels that prevent scientific peer review or public benefit. Technologies that could revolutionize energy production or transportation remain locked in classified programs. Corporate suppression of research extends beyond specific industries to influence academic institutions through funding restrictions and publication controls. Universities dependent on corporate funding face pressure to avoid research topics that might harm their sponsors' interests. Government surveillance capabilities and data collection programs operate largely in secret, with the public only learning about these systems through occasional leaks or whistleblowers. The full extent of digital monitoring and control remains hidden from public scrutiny. Archaeological discoveries that challenge conventional historical timelines or religious beliefs sometimes face suppression or marginalization. Evidence of advanced ancient civilizations or anomalous artifacts that don't fit established paradigms may be ignored or explained away, rather than investigated thoroughly. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed extensive patterns of information suppression and manipulation by governments, health organizations, and media outlets. Laboratory origin theories, treatment effectiveness data, and vaccine safety information were all subject to censorship and control. Financial institutions and central banks operate with limited transparency, concealing the mechanisms through which monetary policy and economic manipulation affect global markets and individual welfare. The true extent of financial control and manipulation remains largely hidden from public understanding. We conclude our exploration of hidden secrets with perhaps the most extraordinary claim of all, the alleged existence of a device that could observe past events as they actually occurred. The chronovisor represents the ultimate suppressed technology, one that could revolutionize our understanding of history while threatening every established narrative about the past. The story begins with Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a respected Italian priest and scientist who claimed in the 1960s to have participated in developing a machine capable of viewing historical events. Ernetti claimed the chronovisor was developed by a team including Nobel laureate Enrico Fermi and rocket pioneer Wernher von Braun. Ernetti's description of the device suggested it worked by capturing electromagnetic radiation that had been emitted in the past and somehow remained detectable in the present. This theoretical foundation, while scientifically problematic, wasn't entirely impossible given contemporary understanding of physics and electromagnetic phenomena. The priest claimed to have witnessed numerous historical events through the device, including the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, speeches by ancient Roman leaders, and performances of lost classical dramas. He even published a photograph allegedly showing Jesus on the cross, though this image was later identified as a reproduction of a modern sculpture. More intriguingly, Ernetti claimed that the Vatican had acquired the chronovisor and classified it at the highest levels of secrecy. According to his account, church authorities recognized that the device posed existential threats to religious faith by potentially revealing the actual nature of biblical events. The implications of such a device would indeed be revolutionary and terrifying for established authorities. If historical events could be observed directly, many official narratives about the past would be vulnerable to verification or refutation. Religious claims, political legitimacy, and cultural myths could all be subjected to unprecedented scrutiny. Ernetti's story included claims that the device revealed disturbing truths about historical events that differed significantly from accepted accounts. The crucifixion, according to his observations, occurred differently than described in the Gospels, and other biblical events showed variations from canonical accounts. The priest claimed the technology was so risky that its developers agreed to destroy all prototypes and materials to prevent misuse. However, he hinted that the Vatican maintained a working device under strict secrecy and control. Scientific analysis of Ernetti's claims reveals significant problems with the theoretical foundation of the chronovisor. The idea that electromagnetic radiation from past events remains accessible in the present contradicts current understanding of physics, making the device's operation as described essentially impossible. However, the story raises important questions about what advanced technologies might exist in classified programs and what historical secrets might be hidden from public knowledge. Even if the chronovisor itself is fictional, it represents anxieties about information control and the suppression of historical truth. The Vatican's alleged involvement in suppressing the device fits patterns we've observed throughout this exploration of hidden secrets. Religious authorities have consistently worked to control narratives about the past, and a technology that could reveal actual historical events would represent an ultimate threat to institutional authority. Whether real or imaginary, the chronovisor story illustrates the ongoing tension between the desire for historical truth and the need for social stability. If such a device existed, would its revelations strengthen human knowledge and freedom? Or would they create chaos by destroying comforting myths and established beliefs? The systematic secrecy surrounding the chronovisor, whether justified or not, demonstrates how even the possibility of ultimate historical verification becomes a threat to existing power structures. The control of historical narrative remains as important today as it was in ancient times. As we reach the end of our journey through 50 hidden secrets, the chronovisor serves as a perfect symbol for the themes we've explored. It represents both the human desire to know the truth about our past and the institutional forces that work to control and suppress that knowledge. The patterns we've observed throughout history continue in the present day. Sacred relics are controlled by religious authorities. Historical documents remain classified or hidden. Alternative narratives are suppressed, and scientific knowledge is restricted when it threatens existing power structures. Understanding these patterns doesn't require accepting every alternative theory or conspiracy claim, but it does suggest the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism about official narratives and continuing to ask difficult questions about what might be hidden from public knowledge. The 50 secrets we've explored represent just a small fraction of the knowledge that has been suppressed, controlled, or lost throughout human history. Each hidden truth reminds us that our understanding of the past, and therefore our present, may be far more limited and manipulated than we realize. The greatest secret of all may be the extent to which information control shapes human consciousness and limits our potential for growth and understanding. By recognizing these patterns, we can begin to think more critically about the sources of our beliefs and the forces that shape our understanding of reality. Whether ancient or modern, religious or scientific, personal or political, the suppression of truth serves the same function, maintaining the power of those who control information while limiting the freedom and potential of those who remain ignorant of hidden realities. We've reached the end of our exploration through 50 of history's most carefully guarded secrets. From the missing Ark of the Covenant to the alleged chronovisor device, from suppressed gospels to erased civilizations, we've uncovered a hidden world that exists parallel to the official narratives we're taught. What have we learned from this journey? Perhaps most importantly, that history is far more complex, contested, and deliberately shaped than most of us realize. The stories we're told about our past aren't simply objective records of what happened, but carefully constructed narratives that serve the interests of those who tell them. We've seen how sacred relics can be used to legitimize power, how documents can be hidden or destroyed to control belief, how historical figures can be transformed or erased to support preferred narratives. We've explored how entire religions and scientific discoveries have been suppressed when they threatened existing authority structures. Throughout our exploration, clear patterns have emerged that transcend specific time periods, cultures, and institutions. The suppression of information follows consistent methods whether we're examining ancient Rome or modern governments, medieval churches or contemporary corporations. First, we've seen how alternative narratives are systematically marginalized or eliminated, whether it's Gnostic Christianity, Celtic religious traditions, or scientific discoveries that challenge conventional wisdom. Inconvenient truths are rarely debated openly, but rather suppressed through institutional pressure. Second, we've observed how women's voices and authority have been particularly targeted for erasure throughout history, from Mary Magdalene to female clergy, from goddess worship to mystical traditions led by women. Feminine perspectives on spirituality and authority have been systematically eliminated or diminished. Third, we've noticed how scientific and technological knowledge has been controlled when it threatens existing power structures. Ancient libraries were destroyed, medieval knowledge was restricted to elite classes, and modern research faces censorship when it challenges powerful interests. Fourth, we've seen how the control of historical narrative serves to maintain contemporary authority. Those who can shape understanding of the past hold tremendous power over present beliefs and future possibilities. This exploration raises fundamental questions about the nature of truth itself. How do we distinguish between legitimate historical scholarship and unfounded speculation? How do we separate genuine suppression of evidence from natural loss of information over time? The answer isn't simple. Some of the secrets we've explored rest on solid archaeological and documentary evidence. Others represent reasonable interpretations of ambiguous data. Still others venture into speculative territory that requires careful skepticism. But the very existence of documented cases of information suppression should make us more, not less, willing to consider possibilities that challenge conventional narratives. When we know that powerful institutions have repeatedly hidden inconvenient truths, we have reason to question what other truths might currently be hidden. This doesn't mean accepting every alternative theory or conspiracy claim. Critical thinking requires evaluating evidence carefully and maintaining appropriate skepticism about extraordinary claims. But it also means remaining open to possibilities that might initially seem unlikely or uncomfortable. The patterns of information control we've explored aren't merely historical curiosities. They continue to shape our world today in ways that directly affect our lives and understanding. Contemporary examples abound. Climate data has been suppressed by fossil fuel companies. Medical research is influenced by pharmaceutical profits. Government surveillance programs operate in secret, and social media algorithms control what information reaches public attention. Understanding historical patterns of suppression helps us recognize these contemporary manifestations and respond more effectively. When we know how information control has worked in the past, we're better equipped to identify and resist it in the present. The digital age has created new opportunities for both information sharing and information control. While we have unprecedented access to diverse perspectives and alternative narratives, we also face sophisticated systems of censorship, manipulation, and disinformation. With awareness of these hidden histories comes responsibility. We cannot simply consume alternative narratives passively, but must engage with them thoughtfully and critically. This means developing better skills for evaluating sources and evidence. Not all suppressed information is accurate, and not all alternative theories are valid. Learning to distinguish between credible and unreliable sources becomes essential. Maintaining intellectual humility. Even when we discover that official narratives are incomplete or incorrect, we must remember that our alternative understanding might also be flawed or partial. Supporting transparency and open inquiry. Whether in academic research, government policy, or corporate behavior, we should advocate for greater openness and accountability from powerful institutions. Protecting diverse voices and perspectives. History shows us repeatedly how minority viewpoints and alternative narratives get suppressed. Defending intellectual and spiritual diversity helps prevent future suppressions. The 50 secrets we've explored represent just the beginning of what might be discovered through continued investigation and open inquiry. Every hidden truth that comes to light suggests others that remain concealed. This doesn't mean accepting every alternative theory or becoming paranoid about institutional deception. Rather, it means maintaining the healthy skepticism and intellectual curiosity that drive genuine learning and discovery. Ask questions about the sources of your beliefs. Consider whose interests are served by the narratives you accept. Look for voices and perspectives that have been marginalized or suppressed. Support research and inquiry that challenges conventional wisdom. Remember that the search for truth is not a destination, but a journey. Each answer reveals new questions. Each discovery opens new possibilities for understanding. As we conclude this exploration, we're left not with definitive answers, but with a greater appreciation for the complexity of truth and the ongoing struggle between those who seek to reveal it and those who seek to control it. The hidden secrets we've uncovered remind us that human history is far richer, stranger, and more contested than official accounts suggest. They also reveal the tremendous power that comes from controlling information and narrative, but perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate the resilience of truth itself. Despite centuries of suppression, evidence survives. Documents are discovered. Alternative perspectives persist. Truth has a way of emerging, even when powerful forces work to keep it hidden. The greatest secret of all may be this, that ordinary people, armed with curiosity, critical thinking, and determination, have the power to uncover hidden truths and challenge established narratives. The authorities who have suppressed information throughout history understood this power, which is why they worked so hard to control it. Today, that power belongs to each of us. How we use it will determine what secrets remain hidden and what truths come to light in the future. The question isn't whether more secrets exist. They certainly do. The question is whether we'll have the courage and wisdom to seek them out, evaluate them fairly, and act on what we discover. Thank you for joining this journey through history's hidden secrets. May it inspire you to continue questioning, investigating, and seeking truth wherever it may lead. The search for truth never ends. It only transforms, evolving with each generation's questions and discoveries. The 50 secrets we've explored today may be tomorrow's accepted history, while today's official truths may become tomorrow's exposed deceptions. In that ongoing transformation lies both the challenge and the hope of human understanding. Truth may be complex, contested, and sometimes hidden, but it remains worth seeking, worth protecting, and worth sharing. The journey continues.